In the MC's mind, he knew that risking one's life was an incredibly difficult thing to do. Whether it was for work, sports, hobbies, or even gambling, giving everything for a single goal was no easy feat in Japan in the year 2034. Abandoning everything in pursuit of a dream was exceptionally difficult. The MC had barely attended school, and even after becoming an adult, he had hardly worked. He had truly wagered everything he had, devoting every waking moment to a single pursuit, sparing only the absolute necessities of eating, sleeping, and relieving himself. His sole objective was to stand at the very top, not merely to become number one, but to attain an absolutely flawless first-place ranking acknowledged by everyone across the world. He sought to become an existence revered almost like a god, the strongest ruler in history who had never once accepted defeat. That person was him. Without question, it was him. He was the world's undisputed number one player in the fully immersive Mobius Online, maintaining an overwhelming lead over everyone else. Yet today, every achievement he had earned, everything he had built throughout his life, vanished into history. A few days earlier, his main character, 7, had been hacked and completely deleted. It wasn't just the character itself. Every piece of offline data, including backups, had been erased as well. He wasn't the only victim. 3,000 players had suffered the same fate. 3,000 high-ranking players. According to what he had heard, the culprit was another top-ranked player who had committed the crime out of jealousy. However, there was no way someone could casually hack and erase the data of 3,000 players. Such an act required an abnormal level of determination. Later, the administrators of Mobius Online released an official announcement. They stated that restoring any of the deleted characters was impossible. As compensation, they could only offer special discounts and promotional benefits for creating new characters. The moment he finished reading the announcement, the MC ripped off his VR headset in fury and shouted a curse. No matter how many times players protested or stormed the company's headquarters demanding answers, the administrators repeated the same response. After venting his frustration, he collapsed onto his bed. He couldn't find the motivation to do anything. Nothing came to mind. Only endless sighs escaped his lips. He knew he would never reclaim his position as the world's number one. Eventually, he sat up. He told himself that he couldn't remain consumed by despair forever. Then a broad grin slowly spread across his face. If that was the case, then he would simply die. That was the conclusion he reached. However, when he opened his eyes once more, he found himself standing in an unfamiliar world. As he looked around, the scenery gradually became recognizable. It looked exactly like Mobius Online. He wondered when he had logged in. As he stood there in confusion, an angry girl called out to him, complaining that he was blocking the path in front of her shop. Turning toward her, he immediately recognized her. She was Ichii, the poster girl of Isekai. He had heard her voice countless times before, yet he had never heard her say anything like this. He wondered if some update had been released while he was away. Meanwhile, Ice's cheeks suddenly flushed bright red as she stared at his face. Stammering, she apologized and timidly asked whether he had come to visit her shop. He couldn't understand why her attitude had changed so suddenly. She had become strangely gentle. She was even blushing. Without thinking, he remarked that she was cute. At the same time, he thought it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call this a god-tier update. The moment she heard those words, Ice's face became even redder before she hurried back inside her shop. Watching from outside, the MC couldn't help but admire what had just happened. It was magnificent. Perhaps some kind of rapport system had been implemented while he had been away. Then he caught sight of his own reflection. He froze. This wasn't 7. It was Second. Second was an alternate character he had created at the same time as his main character, 7. Unlike his main account, it had never been trained. It was merely a storage character with 0 experience points. Now occupying Second's body, he let out a long sigh. It was hopeless. He couldn't bring himself to start Mobius Online all over again. He decided he would simply log out. Yet when he tried, nothing happened. He couldn't log out. In fact, he couldn't even open the settings menu. He wondered if the game had bugged out. Perhaps he should use the emergency stop function to return to reality. Then, little by little, realization dawned upon him. A faint smirk appeared on his lips. Of course, there was no reality left for him to return to. He had already died. Even so, one question remained. Why was he inside Mobius Online? Was the afterlife somehow the world of Mobius? No. From the bottom of his heart, he had always wished that he could be reborn into the world of Mobius Online. If such a thing were possible, he had wanted nothing more than to be born inside the world of a game. Looking back, even he had to admit those had been rather pathetic last wishes. Could they have actually come true? To make sure, he pinched himself. A sharp pain shot through him, forcing a gasp from his lips. The sharp pain left him stunned. Even though this was supposed to be a game, it hurt. If the reason he couldn't log out and Aishan's unusually human behavior were connected, then there was only one possible explanation. If that were true, then he had been reborn. reborn inside the world of a game. Tears of joy welled up in his eyes. He shouted over and over that this was the greatest thing imaginable, expressing his gratitude with all his heart. Completely forgetting himself, Second danced around like a madman for nearly an hour, making bizarre noises the entire time. Compared to the happiest moment of his previous life, when Seven had become the world's #1 player, this joy was dozens, hundreds, even thousands of times greater. Before long, a city guard seized him from behind and pinned him down, informing him that he was under arrest. The guard turned toward Ice and asked whether he had the right person. She confirmed it, explaining that Second had been causing a disturbance in front of her shop and asking them to take him away. Cold sweat instantly covered Second's back. A short while later, he found himself inside the third chivalric order station. A woman seated across from him began questioning him, asking why he had been behaving that way. Second admitted that he had simply gotten carried away. The people before him belonged to the third chivalric order of the Kingdom of Castal. Put simply, they were this world's police. He was currently being interrogated at one of their stations. The woman looked him over before asking whether he was a noble. If so, which family did he belong to? Why was he alone? Where had his companions gone? Second replied that he wasn't a noble. While answering, he secretly observed her appearance. She looked like a graceful and dignified female knight. She wasn't merely cute. She was beautiful. Yet he had never encountered an NPC who looked like her before. Could it be that she existed only in this world? The female knight glared at him. Without warning, she slammed both hands onto the table. She declared that noble privileges meant nothing to the third chivalric order. Whoever broke the law committed a crime, and every crime was evil. Evil would be judged, while protecting honest citizens was their duty and their justice. She demanded that he confess, insisting she already possessed overwhelming evidence. Second calmly repeated that he wasn't a noble. Before he could finish speaking, she cut him off. He quickly realized that trying to reason with her was pointless. After taking a deep breath, the female knight suddenly regained her composure. She remarked that if he intended to remain silent, then she had no other choice. Her hand gripped the hilt of her sword, ready to draw it at any moment. Second immediately became nervous and hurriedly told her to wait, promising that he would answer her questions. Satisfied, she lowered her hand and remarked that he should have cooperated from the beginning. She then ordered him to state his name and occupation. Second introduced himself and said he was an adventurer. The female knight immediately accused him of lying. Unsure how to respond, Second silently wondered what he should do. The knight narrowed her eyes. She pointed out that his clothes were far too finely tailored for an ordinary adventurer and looked extremely expensive. Only then did Second realize what the problem was. Although this equipment wasn't nearly as extravagant as what Seven had worn, he had still dressed this alternate character in rare clothing simply because it looked good. That was why everyone assumed he was a noble. This was seriously bad. The conflict between the lower ranks of the third chivalric order and the nobility had always been well known within the game. This female knight had accumulated countless grudges against the upper divisions, who maintained close ties with the aristocracy. She was, in every sense, a constable overflowing with justice. Judging by her behavior, her sense of justice exceeded that of most ordinary people. Second realized he had no way to prove his identity. He had no idea what to do. The female knight raised her voice once more, demanding that he reveal what he was plotting. Before she could continue, the door suddenly opened. A man stepped inside. Without hesitation, he lightly struck the top of her head with his fist while calling her name in exasperation. Turning toward Second, he apologized for his subordinate's rude behavior and explained that he would personally conduct the questioning instead. Second quietly nodded. The man politely apologized once again before explaining that they suspected Second of intentionally obstructing business. He then requested that Second briefly explain both his social status and his purpose. Second introduced himself once more, stating that he was 17 years old and worked as an adventurer. Inwardly, however, he reflected on the truth. His real name was Sada Shikaru. He had been 28 years old, single, unemployed. Since he had originally registered this character as 17 years old, he answered using that age instead. The man acknowledged the information before mentioning that several witnesses had reported seeing Second dancing wildly and making strange noises in front of a grocery store. He then asked why he had done it. Second apologized, explaining that he had absent-mindedly zoned out and gotten carried away. The man remarked that, in that case, Second admitted to the incident. He then asked what his intentions had been. Second answered that he had never intended to interfere with the store's business, and that he hadn't had any particular objective at all. Inside, he couldn't help feeling utterly pathetic. For the first time, he truly realized that he was living within a proper society now. The man let out a quiet sigh. He concluded that Second was claiming he had not intentionally obstructed the business. Second confirmed that was correct. Afterward, he paid compensation to Ice's grocery store and was released. Even so, he couldn't help wondering whether a society could really function like this. The compensation paid to Ice's store amounted to only 150,000 CL. That amount of money wasn't even enough to buy armor that reached the level of, "At least I won't look like a beginner wearing this." At the moment, Second possessed a little over 2 billion CL. Without wasting any time, he immediately changed into the rare, stylish clothes that had previously caused everyone to mistake him for a noble. He also purchased a decent set of full-body armor. Altogether, the equipment cost him 2,300,000 CL. Whether that amount was considered expensive or cheap in this world, however, he had no idea. The prices seemed completely different from those in the Mobius Online he remembered. That meant he needed to determine the value of this world's currency as quickly as possible. Just then, his stomach let out a loud growl. The timing was perfect. He decided to get something to eat. By checking the prices of meals and lodging, he could easily estimate the purchasing power of CL in this world. Before long, he spotted a nearby establishment. If he remembered correctly, the first floor also functioned as a tavern. Without hesitation, Second walked inside. A young receptionist stepped forward to welcome him. He immediately asked how much it cost to stay for one night. Instead of answering, the young woman simply stared at him in silence. After waiting for a moment, Second repeated his question. Only then did she suddenly come back to her senses, awkwardly apologizing before asking if he had meant a one-night stay. Deep down, Second couldn't help recalling the same strange reaction Ichii had shown earlier. This receptionist's behavior was suspiciously similar. Finally regaining her composure, she explained that one night's stay cost 7,000 CL, including both breakfast and dinner. Without meals, it would be 4,000 CL. Second was surprised by how inexpensive it sounded. Then realization struck him. That full-body armor he had just purchased was actually an incredibly high-class item. After thinking it over, he decided to stay for 5 nights without meals. The receptionist quickly accepted his request. She handed him the room key. The instant their hands touched, she froze. Her face immediately turned bright red. Second blinked in confusion. He couldn't understand why she had reacted that way. Not long afterward, he made his way to the tavern. Sitting by himself, he casually looked around the room. He soon noticed several young women secretly stealing glances at him. At that moment, everything finally made sense. He stood out far too much, especially considering the passionate looks those girls were giving him. The reason was his avatar. This appearance had been created using a limited-time, premium avatar designed to be exceptionally beautiful. Inside an online game, no matter how attractive a character looked, nobody paid much attention. But in a world where everyone existed as real people, that was an entirely different story. Second smugly reflected that, in this body, he was finally beginning to understand that this place was no longer merely the inside of an online game. A pleasant shiver ran down his spine. Without realizing it, a smile spread across his face. Everything he accomplished here would have real meaning. None of his efforts would ever be wasted. This was the supreme world he had always longed for, a world where he believed there was nothing greater beyond it. Then the words people had spoken to him before his reincarnation echoed through his mind. No matter how hard he tried in an online game, it was completely meaningless. Someone had told him to hurry back to reality. Another had insisted that becoming the world's #1 player was ultimately pointless. Others had urged him to attend school properly, to work seriously, and to think about what he intended to do with his future. But in this world, every reasonable argument that had been forced upon him throughout his life, along with the frustration buried deep within his heart, had all become meaningless. A small chuckle escaped his lips. Before long, he found himself laughing openly. Then Second raised his head. His eyes were filled with unwavering determination. He had made up his mind. Once again, he would become the #1 in the world. The next morning, Second woke up groaning in pain. He had gotten far too carried away the previous night. Chugging alcohol despite not being accustomed to drinking had been a terrible idea, even if it was to celebrate his reincarnation into a parallel world. As a result, he was now suffering from a hangover. After getting out of bed, Second reflected on the fact that this world was no longer just a game. Mabayon was now his reality. In this world, countless skills were considered essential, so there was no question that he had to acquire them. The core system of Mabayon revolved around experience points. Experience was required not only to learn new skills, but also to increase one's attributes. That meant earning experience had to be his top priority. Gaining experience was straightforward. One simply had to defeat monsters or complete quests. The available skills covered an enormous range of combat techniques, magical abilities, and crafting professions. Each skill possessed its own ranking system, beginning from 16th class and progressing to 1st class. Beyond that were the higher ranks starting from 1st grade and advancing all the way to 9th grade. There was also an exceptionally rare rank known as a title. Raising a skill's rank also required experience points. Likewise, increasing one's attributes demanded experience, though the way those attributes developed depended entirely on the growth type selected when the character was created. A short while later, Second headed to the tavern on the first floor and ordered a serving of curry rice from a nearby waitress. She greeted him warmly, unaware of the many curious glances directed at him. Second became absorbed in thought. He suddenly remembered something. As expected, the growth type of this character, Second, was identical to that of his former character, 7, an all-rounder. The defining characteristic of an all-rounder was that every attribute increased evenly when experience was gained, without any particular stat receiving preference over another. That growth type had both advantages and disadvantages. It was considered ideal for someone striving to become the strongest in the world, but at the same time, it embodied the phrase jack of all trades, master of none. The waitress soon returned with his meal and politely apologized for the wait. As he ate, Second continued organizing his thoughts. Unlike specialized growth types, whose attributes tended to become heavily skewed towards certain strengths while neglecting others, an all-rounder could develop every attribute simultaneously without imbalance. In that sense, it was undeniably an outstanding growth type. However, the trade-off was that its early development was significantly harsher than that of every other growth type. If that was the case, then he had no choice but to rely on that method. After finishing breakfast, Second made his way to a shop that specialized in potions. Without hesitation, he requested every bottle of detoxify, dispel, and recovery high potions they had in stock. The staff were left speechless. After a long moment, the elderly shopkeeper finally managed to speak. He explained that including the inventory and storage, purchasing that many potions would cost an astonishing sum. Ignoring the warning, Second simply asked how many bottles they had. The old man answered that they currently had nearly 630 bottles. Satisfied, Second instructed them to prepare every single one. Both staff members were stunned. The potions he had just purchased were enhanced high potions that possessed detoxify, dispel, and recovery effects. Each bottle cost 120,000 CL. At 120,000 CL per bottle for 630 bottles, the total came to 75,600,000 CL. After recovering from their shock, the old shopkeeper immediately began gathering the potions. Once everything had been prepared, he respectfully apologized for making Second wait. Second decided to pay for all of the potions in cash and immediately store them inside his inventory. Before leaving, he informed the shop staff that he would also need nearly 9,000 more bottles and asked them to restock as many as possible for him. The two employees were left standing there with their jaws hanging open once again. As for what Second intended to do with such an enormous quantity of high-grade potions, the answer lay in a method formerly known in Mob-ion as the DK tactic. It was a cheat-like strategy for gaining experience during the early stages of the game. The concept originated from an old 8-bit game called Dinosaur Quest, where players used items that dealt fixed damage to defeat enemies with extremely high evasion rates. Inspired by that trick, Second had devised a similar method for earning experience. The truth was that potions with detoxify, dispel, and recovery effects also inflicted fixed damage on undead monsters. The detoxify, dispel, recovery high potion plus that he had purchased dealt a fixed 1,200 points of damage to undead enemies. That amount of damage was sufficient to steadily wear down the health of an intermediate-level undead monster known as the Viper Zombie, a creature famous for providing a relatively generous amount of experience compared to other undead monsters. In other words, by simply throwing these potions at Viper Zombies, anyone could defeat them. Even a complete beginner or a 3-year-old child would be capable of wiping them out. However, this method was typically used only by alternate characters belonging to high-level players. The reason was simple. It cost an absurd amount of money. To earn a worthwhile amount of experience, at least 10,000 of these potions were required. Purchasing that many would cost approximately 1.2 billion CL. Only players who already possessed a powerful main character could casually prepare such a massive amount of money. As a result, the DK tactic was an extraordinarily effective method for earning experience in the beginning, but its usefulness was limited to the early stages. Once a player reached the intermediate level, the method ceased to be practical. Afterward, Second visited the stables to purchase a horse. He selected a black horse and decided that, starting today, its name would be Seventh Taio. A faint smirk appeared on his face. He never imagined that the day would come when he would have to rely on this strategy. With his preparations complete, Second set off on his journey. Eventually, he arrived at a cave. As he walked through its interior, he noted that he had already traveled nearly 2 hours by horseback away from the royal capital. According to his memories, there was a famous hunting ground hidden inside a large cave located behind an old mine. Yet despite its reputation, there was not a single person in sight. Perhaps the DK tactic had not been discovered in this world yet. Or perhaps the potions were simply too expensive for most people to use in such a manner. There was also the possibility that there were not many beginners around to begin with. Whatever the reason, the absence of other people worked in his favor. With nobody else present, he could hunt as much as he pleased. After searching for several minutes, Second finally found what he was looking for. A Viper Zombie. The monster sensed his presence and slowly turned toward him. The sight immediately sent a shiver of disgust through Second. They were far more revolting in reality than they had ever appeared inside a game. Determined to finish the task as quickly as possible and return home, he quickly hid behind a nearby rock and carefully observed the creature. The moment he confirmed its position, he began throwing potions one after another. Each bottle shattered upon impact. Every viper zombie struck by the barrage was instantly defeated. A delighted smile spread across Second's face. For some reason, this felt strangely satisfying. After clearing one hunting ground, he moved to the next and repeated the process endlessly. By the time he returned to the first hunting area, the defeated viper zombies had already respawned, ready to be purged once more. Without stopping to rest even once, Second continued hurling potions at the undead monsters. Bottle after bottle shattered against their bodies. He kept going relentlessly until every one of the 630 bottles had been used up. The amount of experience he had earned was more than satisfactory. If he continued at this pace, it would not be long before Second acquired nearly all of the essential skills he needed. He would also be able to raise their ranks steadily. Having completely lost track of time, Second clicked his tongue. The sun had already set. Deciding it was time to head back, he mounted his horse and retraced the path to the royal capital. As soon as he arrived, he thought about treating himself to a good meal, getting drunk, soaking in a hot bath, and then going straight to sleep. Just then, a familiar woman called out to him. The instant he recognized her voice, Second had a bad feeling. If he remembered correctly, she was that beautiful yet unbelievably dense female knight named Sylvia. Climbing down from his horse, Second thanked her for what had happened the previous day. Sylvia responded in an unfriendly tone, recognizing him as the same troublesome Second she had met yesterday. She immediately questioned what he was doing wandering around so late at night. Seeing the suspicion in her eyes, Second realized he was being interrogated. He answered that he had spent the day at the mines. Sylvia looked at him skeptically. The mines? What had he gone there for? Second calmly explained that he had been earning experience inside the large cave located behind the mines. Her expression only became more doubtful. She told him that if he was going to lie, he should at least make it believable. According to her, claiming that he had deliberately entered such a dangerous place just to hunt monsters made no sense at all. Confused by her reaction, Second frowned. He asked what she meant and casually added that the viper zombies there were worth hunting because they provided excellent experience. Sylvia stared at him expressionlessly. In her mind, she concluded that he either completely lacked common sense or that something was seriously wrong with his head. Second could not help finding her incredibly irritating. Then something she had said suddenly caught his attention. She had referred to that place as dangerous. He asked if she would answer another question. Sylvia gave her permission. Second asked how many dungeons existed. He recalled that in Ma-Bayon, there were 21 dungeons in total. They were considered treasure troves, and players constantly worked together to conquer them, sharing information while searching for the safest and most efficient routes through each one. However, Sylvia looked puzzled by the question. According to her, there were only 19 dungeons. Second quietly confirmed his suspicion. He then asked how many of those dungeons were currently being explored. Sylvia answered without hesitation. Only 13. Hearing that answer, Second fell silent. After thanking her, he asked if he could be on his way. Sylvia simply told him to leave already. Without another word, Second continued toward his destination. By now, he had more or less understood the truth. In this world, death was absolute. When people died, they truly died. Unlike the game, there was no revival after failure. Because of that, very few people were willing to risk their lives simply to become stronger. To them, death meant the end of everything. A smile slowly spread across Second's face. He possessed knowledge that players in the game had only obtained after risking their lives thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands, of times. With all of that information already in his hands, Second could not help but smirk. He might reach the position of the strongest person in the world far sooner than he had originally expected. The next morning, Second set out on his journey once again. He figured that once they had earned a certain amount of experience, this would naturally become their next destination. The Grand Royal Library. Why the library? The reason lay in Mobian's skill acquisition system. In Ma-Bayon, there were primarily two ways to acquire skills. The first was by reading skill books. The Grand Royal Library housed a vast collection of such books. A librarian politely approached him and asked what he was looking for. Second's gaze briefly fell upon her chest before he replied that he was fine. The librarian acknowledged his answer and quietly left. Second swept his gaze across the countless bookshelves. Although it was called reading, simply flipping through the pages was enough to fulfill the requirement. Well then, the book he needed should be somewhere around here. He began moving through the rows of shelves at a brisk pace. Before long, he found the books he had been searching for. This time, he intended to learn two fundamental skills shared by both swordsmanship and archery, along with the four elemental variants of the sorcery skill known as the Opo-Opo form, or first form. There were many kinds of combat skills in Mob-ion. Besides swordsmanship and archery, there were also skills such as spearmanship, unarmed combat, and shieldmanship. Each major combat discipline possessed 9 minor skills: pawn, spear, knight, silver general, gold general, bishop, castle, promoted bishop, and promoted rook. For now, he planned to acquire only the fundamental pawn and spear skills for both swordsmanship and archery. As expected, he obtained all of them without any difficulty. Next came sorcery. Sorcery consisted of 4 elemental attributes: fire, water, wind, and earth. Each element contained 5 forms: Oppo form, Raptor form, Coral form, 4th form, and 5th form. The grimoires available in the Grand Royal Library were the same as they had been the last time he played Mob-ion. Only the 4 elemental Oppo form grimoires could be found here. He assumed the remaining grimoires could only be obtained from the Royal School of Magic or by completing high-difficulty quests. While considering that possibility, he finished acquiring all 4 Oppo forms without any trouble. Having read every fundamental skill book he wanted, Second decided it was time to leave. On his way out, he witnessed the librarian stumble to the floor after accidentally bumping into a man. Second narrowed his eyes for a moment before dismissing the incident and continuing on his way. Even so, he couldn't help thinking that the library had yielded an abundant harvest. Now it was time to put his plans into action. The first step was to earn experience safely by relying on long-range attacks with archery. The second step was to establish a reliable close-range fighting style through swordsmanship, whose damage output was both effective and easy to utilize. The third step was to prepare powerful trump cards against stronger enemies by developing high-powered sorcery. As for the fourth step, conjuration, the limited-time avatar he had purchased when creating this alternate character, Second, came with a premium spirit ticket. Using it greatly increased the chances of summoning a rare spirit, so there was no reason to neglect improving his conjuration skills. However, conjuration had its limitations as a primary combat method, making it better suited as a supporting ability. It would be most efficient to begin training conjuration only after his archery, swordsmanship, and sorcery had reached a respectable level. Now that his course of action had been decided, he began allocating the experience points he had accumulated to increase the ranks of the skills he had just acquired. The weapon shop came to mind as he distributed his experience. For archery, he only invested enough points to make it viable in combat. For the Oppo forms of sorcery, he raised them to 5th class to shorten their casting times. As for pawn swordsmanship, he allocated just enough experience to provide himself with a measure of insurance whenever he was forced into close-quarters combat. That was enough to completely exhaust the experience points he had available. Well, this would have to do for now. These fundamental skills were sufficient for the time being. If he needed anything else later, he could simply return to the Grand Royal Library and acquire additional skill books. His next objective was to obtain the essential archery skills. The skills required for archery were not limited to pawn and spear. Nearly all of the remaining branches were indispensable, including knight, silver general, gold general, bishop, and castle. Each granted a unique technique. Knight archery unlocked precise shot. Silver general archery granted a powerful single-target attack. Gold general archery provided spread strike, along with a knockback effect. Bishop archery granted a powerful piercing attack. Castle archery offered an overwhelmingly powerful single-target strike. Among them, knight archery, gold general archery, and castle archery were especially indispensable. Simply learning these three would increase the number of tactical options available to him several-fold. Unlike the fundamental pawn and spear skills, however, these advanced skills could not be obtained simply by reading books. Second headed to the weapon shop and purchased a longbow. There was another method of acquiring skills in Mob-ion. He needed to fulfill the conditions associated with skill quests. Fortunately, if his goal was merely to satisfy the acquisition requirements, there was no need to formally accept the quests themselves. After thanking him for his purchase, the shopkeeper saw him off. Second mounted his horse and continued onward. While riding, he killed a monster with a single arrow. A new skill was acquired, knight archery. He then proceeded to kill 20 more monsters in succession, defeating each with a single shot. Another skill was unlocked, silver general archery. Next, he defeated 10 monsters consecutively while keeping each target within a 3-meter radius. This earned him another skill, gold general archery. Bishop archery, however, was considerably more troublesome. It required fulfilling 2 separate conditions. The first was to kill 5 monsters simultaneously using spear archery. The second was to kill 2 monsters at the same time from a distance of at least 25 meters by combining spear archery with knight archery. With that, he finally acquired bishop archery. Now the last skill remained, castle archery. It was the most tedious skill to obtain, yet it also possessed the greatest single-target offensive power. Even at the 16th class, it could unleash attacks equal to 250% of its normal firepower. If raised all the way to the 9th grade, that multiplier soared to an astonishing 600%. It was an exceptionally practical skill, capable of producing overwhelming firepower with a single shot, making it one of the strongest techniques available in archery. Unfortunately, its acquisition requirements were equally infamous. Even if all the other troublesome skill requirements were combined, castle archery would still likely rank among the 10 worst. The first condition required killing 1,000 monsters using silver general archery. The second required landing 500 critical hits with silver general archery. Those two would naturally be completed over time, so they were not much of a concern. The real problem was the final condition. He had to defeat 3 monsters consecutively, each with a single shot from at least 5 meters away, by combining knight archery and silver general archery. Furthermore, each monster had to have already attacked another person and reduced that person's HP by at least 50%. Just thinking about it made Second sigh. If he failed even once, the entire challenge would reset, forcing him to start from the beginning. It was nothing short of hell. If Mob-Ion were still an online game, he could simply ask other players to let their HP fall below 50% before finishing off the monsters himself. Completing the requirement would have been relatively simple. But this was no longer a game. Having half of one's HP depleted meant standing on the brink of death. There was no way anyone would willingly agree to such a request. He briefly wondered if he could somehow engineer such situations himself. Almost immediately, he dismissed the idea. No, that would be even more unreasonable. Even so, he desperately wanted castle archery. It was an indispensable skill for any archer. In the end, he reluctantly accepted reality. He would simply fulfill the first 2 requirements, 1,000 silver general archery kills and 500 silver general archery critical hits, while patiently waiting for an opportunity to complete the final condition. That opportunity arrived in a way he never expected. A week had passed since his reincarnation. He had made full use of the hit-and-run tactic, steadily raising the ranks of his various skills. Having achieved satisfactory progress, he decided it was finally time to begin training his swordsmanship. At that moment, a loud scream echoed through the forest. Not far away, someone cursed in desperation. Before the man could finish speaking, something struck him. Hidden among the bushes, Second silently observed the situation. Then he saw them. Scarlet mantises. The scene unfolding before him caused his eyes to freeze. Humans and monsters clashed in desperate combat. Harsh breathing filled the air. Weapons collided with deafening clangs. The scent of earth mixed with the smell of fresh blood. Cries of fear echoed throughout the forest. This was nothing like the Mob-Ion he remembered. This was reality. From his hiding place, Second counted 5 people lying motionless on the ground. Another 5 remained standing, swords drawn as they desperately maintained a circular defensive formation. At this rate, they would all be overwhelmed and slaughtered. A faint smile crept across his face. 5 people. This might be enough to fulfill the conditions for castle archery. For a brief moment he hesitated. Should he wait until those 5 had each lost at least half their HP? Doing so would greatly increase the chances of completing the requirement. Then the thought hit him. Second clenched his teeth. He might be able to obtain castle archery this way, but this wasn't right. People were dying. These weren't players. They were real people. Just like him, each of them had already risked everything in pursuit of their own goals, only to have those dreams cut short. Now they were about to lose their lives as well. He couldn't simply stand by and watch. Such despair was unbearable. Without another moment's hesitation, Second stepped out from the bushes with his longbow in hand. He shouted for the warriors to get down. The warriors turned toward him in surprise. Realizing the urgency in his voice, they immediately warned the others and dropped to the ground. Without wasting a single moment, Second activated 5th grade spear archery. His arrow flew with flawless precision. It pierced through its targets in an instant. The scarlet mantises were slain immediately. The surviving warriors stood frozen in shock. The knights stood frozen in shock, and among them was Sylvia. Her eyes remained fixed on Second, unable to look away. She could not help but admire how fearlessly he had rushed into such a desperate situation. The image of him charging forward without hesitation stirred something deep within her. His fearless bearing reminded her of the world's strongest man. Her first impression of Second had been terrible. She had dismissed him as nothing more than a young noble who had grown up in comfort, sheltered from hardship, lacking common sense, and never considering the trouble he caused others. Yet that same man had defeated 6 scarlet mantises in less than 20 seconds. He had accomplished such an impossible feat with nothing more than an ordinary longbow and extraordinary archery. Sylvia could only wonder how much relentless training and experience he must have accumulated to reach such a level. She then turned those thoughts toward herself. Since childhood, she had devoted herself to becoming a knight, advancing with nothing but a single sword in her hands. Yet no matter how hard she tried, it had all been in vain. Her own family mocked her for lacking talent with the sword. Even after joining the 3rd Chivalric Order, she found herself assigned to the lowest-ranked division, a unit notorious for its incompetence and lax discipline. No one ever acknowledged her strength. To everyone around her, she was merely an idealistic young woman who constantly lectured others about justice. Worse still, she lacked the power to uphold the very justice she believed in. Whenever she exposed the crimes or corruption of nobles, her superiors always pressured her into abandoning the matter. Over time, she came to despise those rotten people in power with all her heart. Even now, despite the deaths of their own comrades, the upper ranks were more concerned with recruiting the very man who had saved them all. Sylvia silently clenched her fist. Was this truly what the chivalric order had become? Was this really the image of knighthood she had admired ever since she was young? If so, then perhaps the ideal she had pursued no longer existed. Elsewhere in the city, an elderly man approached Second with a proposal. Instead of thanking him for rescuing everyone during the battle, the old man immediately brought up the Adventurers Guild. Second had expected words of gratitude, so hearing that proposal first only irritated him. The old man apologized for rushing the conversation. He explained that, despite working as an adventurer, Second did not belong to any guild. Second remained silent. It was true that he had never affiliated himself with the Adventurers Guild, but he had never seen any reason to do so. Within the kingdom of Castal, the Adventurers Guild officially existed to organize requests such as monster subjugation and dispatch adventurers accordingly. In reality, however, it served another purpose. It functioned as a means for the kingdom to keep adventurers under its control by collecting and handing over their personal information. Second already knew this because the truth had been recorded in Mobian stories. He politely declined the invitation. The old man appeared slightly surprised, believing it was a favorable offer. Second explained that money was not a concern for him, nor did he wish to bind himself to any organization. The old man accepted the explanation, though he still seemed reluctant to give up. He remarked that neither the Adventurers Guild nor the Chivalric Order would willingly allow someone as exceptional as Second to remain an unaffiliated adventurer. After witnessing the recent incident, everyone had become fully aware of Second's overwhelming ability. As a result, influential people had become eager to recruit him. Second questioned whether that meant the guild intended to protect him. The old man admitted that such protection would indeed be one of its roles. Second smiled politely, though inwardly he grew suspicious. The old man claimed that everyone now knew his true strength. However, the only people who had witnessed the battle were the members of the Third Chivalric Order. Why were they so desperate to force him into joining an organization? To him, becoming affiliated with a guild would only become another obstacle on his path toward becoming the world's strongest. He therefore declined once more. The old man accepted his answer. Instead, he proposed assigning Sylvia to accompany him. With a member of the Third Chivalric Order constantly at his side, they would at least be able to monitor his activities. The moment Second heard Sylvia's name, he instinctively tensed. The old man continued, explaining that he could not think of any better way to persuade a noble like Second. Sylvia had become well known throughout the royal capital as a knight who showed no favoritism toward nobles. She would undoubtedly keep a close eye on him. Second frowned. The old man's insistence on assigning Sylvia seemed suspicious. Still, he did not yet know their true objective. Sylvia was famous for opposing corrupt nobles, while the upper ranks of the chivalric order maintained close ties with those very nobles. In other words, Sylvia had become a nuisance to the leadership. Perhaps this assignment was actually intended as a demotion. If that was the case, then it was actually an excellent opportunity for him. He had the chance to gain a capable and attractive female knight as a companion without spending anything. Second asked how long Sylvia would remain with him. The old man replied that they should discuss the matter with her directly. At that moment, Sylvia arrived wearing ordinary casual clothing. Second could not take his eyes off her. The old man informed her that she would now be responsible for serving as Second's escort. As for the duration of the assignment, the chivalric order would take both her opinion and Second's wishes into consideration. Sylvia looked genuinely surprised. Second quietly concluded that such a reaction was only natural. To anyone in her position, this assignment was effectively a demotion. Furthermore, despite claiming that her opinion would be respected, it was obvious that the old man alone possessed the authority to determine the length of her assignment. Everything pointed to the chivalric order viewing her as an unwanted burden. The old man asked whether she had any particular preference regarding the length of her assignment. Having little choice, Sylvia simply accepted. Her hand tightened into a fist against her chest. At that same moment, Second found himself staring at her once again. When he came back to his senses, he noticed the old man watching him with a knowing expression. Clearing his throat, Second proposed a term of 2 years. Privately, he calculated that 2 years would be more than enough time for him to continue pursuing the title of the world's strongest. The old man accepted immediately. Thus, the female knight Sylvia officially became Second's escort. Afterward, the old man spoke privately with Sylvia. However, Sylvia barely listened. Her thoughts remained occupied by the belief that this assignment was nothing more than a demotion, that the chivalric order was simply casting aside someone they considered dead weight. Sylvia was the second daughter of the prestigious Virginia Knight family. For those born into the Virginia household, becoming a distinguished knight and earning glory on the battlefield was considered both an honor and a duty. Yet all of her efforts had amounted to nothing. She possessed no talent for swordsmanship. Her older brother, older sister, and even her parents all regarded her as a failure. Even after finally achieving her dream of becoming a knight, nothing had truly changed. At that moment, Second interrupted her train of thought by suggesting that they make a deal. Second assumed that the old man had probably instructed Sylvia to persuade or even seduce him into joining the chivalric order. Sylvia was startled by his sudden proposal. She could not understand why Second had brought up such a topic so unexpectedly. With everything that had happened that day, she assumed he must simply have had too many shocking experiences. In the end, she decided that she would at least hear what he had to say. She had no idea that this conversation would completely change the course of her life. Second began by saying that he believed Sylvia truly wished to serve proudly as a knight. Because of that, he wanted to help her. The moment he addressed her by name so naturally, Sylvia's heart skipped a beat. Second possessed an exceptionally handsome appearance. Until now, Sylvia had never allowed herself to think about romance, having devoted all of her time and effort to mastering the sword. Yet, as she sat there drinking mead with him, unfamiliar emotions quietly began to surface within her. Second continued by telling her that if she truly despised her current circumstances, then she should resolve to leave the Third Chivalric Order once and for all and accompany him instead. The moment she heard those words, Sylvia's face turned bright red. She was so flustered that she could barely speak. Seeing her panic, Second immediately hurried to clarify himself, insisting that he was merely proposing a deal. Still blushing intensely, Sylvia forced herself to calm down, reminding herself that it was nothing more than a negotiation and not a confession of love. To steady herself, she emptied her drink in a single gulp. Once she appeared calmer, Second continued. He said that he assumed Sylvia could no longer tolerate submitting to corrupt authority. If that was the case, then all she needed was enough strength to oppose them, and he possessed the means to help her obtain that strength. Sylvia's expression became serious. She quietly admitted that she had trained with the sword continuously since the age of 4. For 13 long years, however, she had never once been able to carry out the justice she had dreamed of protecting. Silence settled between them. After scratching his head awkwardly, Second apologized before speaking honestly. If she truly lacked talent with the sword, then perhaps she should simply try another weapon. A spear, a bow, anything else. Sylvia's eyes widened with anger. Unable to contain herself, she grabbed him by the collar. How could he possibly understand everything she had struggled through until now? She clenched her teeth tightly. Then, after a moment, reality caught up with her. Her grip loosened, and she quietly released him. Slowly, she admitted that Second was right. She had become stubborn. Even though countless people had told her she lacked talent with the sword, she had stubbornly continued training. To her, knights were figures who wore shining armor, wielded swords, rode horses, and gallantly rushed in whenever people were in danger. That had always been the knight she wanted to become. A famous knight, a champion of justice who would never bow before evil. Tears gradually gathered in her eyes. She could only whisper to herself how pitiful she truly was. Second frankly told her to stop forcing herself to cling to such a narrow image of knighthood. Any weapon could serve the same purpose. What truly mattered was becoming someone who rushed fearlessly into danger to protect others. That alone was enough. Sylvia fell silent. He was right. There was no reason to become obsessed with appearances or traditions. The words about rushing fearlessly into danger suddenly reminded her of Second himself. The image of him charging into battle to rescue everyone resurfaced vividly in her mind. Her eyes widened as she looked at him with renewed admiration. After remaining silent for a while, Sylvia finally reached a decision. She told Second that she would accompany him. A satisfied smile spread across Second's face. Sylvia found herself staring at him again before suddenly realizing it, causing her cheeks to turn red once more as she hurriedly looked away. Second then announced that, if they were to travel together, he wished to share his dream with her. With tremendous enthusiasm, he declared that no matter what happened, he would become the world's #1. To Sylvia, it sounded like an enormous dream, one so unrealistic that many people would probably laugh at it. Yet as he spoke, his smile resembled that of an innocent young boy. His eyes sparkled with genuine determination. Watching him, Sylvia found herself wanting to accompany him and lend him her support. She was certain that if she did, many interesting things would happen. For the first time in her life, she experienced such a refreshing night. Her future, which had once seemed so bleak, suddenly appeared much brighter. Later that night, after their discussion ended, they each returned to their own rooms. As soon as Second sat down on his bed, the smile on his face slowly widened before finally turning in a loud laughter that echoed outside his room. Everything had gone even better than he had expected. He had taken advantage of a heartbroken girl's vulnerable state, gotten her slightly drunk, and won her over through what he freely admitted to himself was an incredibly underhanded method. Even so, he believed the outcome would ultimately benefit her as well. He suspected that Sylvia's true talent lay in either archery or magic. After all, despite spending 13 years practicing swordsmanship, she remained hopelessly untalented with the blade. That could only mean her natural growth aptitude was probably dexterity-oriented or intelligence-oriented. There was also the possibility that she possessed talents better suited for crafting or production professions. Regardless, obtaining such a companion was enormously valuable. Having an ally would dramatically improve his safety during battles. Convincing Sylvia to leave the troublesome chivalric order and join him had been another major success. It truly felt as though he had killed 2 birds with 1 stone. No, 3 birds. Actually 4. Thinking back on the battle with the Scarlet Manises, he realized they had never been particularly dangerous monsters in the first place. Considering his current abilities, defeating them had practically been expected. That meant today's battle had been the perfect opportunity. Not only had he gained a trustworthy companion, but he had also learned the castle archery skill he had desired for so long. The more he thought about everything that had happened, the wider his smile became. Starting tomorrow, life was going to become much more exciting. His first priority would be training Sylvia and helping her acquire the proper skills she truly needed. After that, he intended to explore dungeons to earn experience points. Searching for rare item drops also sounded worthwhile. The thought of everything waiting for him made another burst of laughter escape his lips. Outside his room, the receptionist could only wonder why he had suddenly started laughing so loudly once again. With a puzzled expression, Sylvia asked about magic archery. Second replied that it was exactly that. He believed that becoming a magic archer, a class specializing in both sorcery and archery, would suit her perfectly. Sylvia's DX was 121, her INT was 103, while all of her other attributes were only in the double digits. She was clearly a DX-oriented type, and her unusually high INT indicated that she was naturally suited to becoming a magic archer. Sylvia admitted that she had never even heard of magic archery before. Hearing that, Second wondered if magic archers simply did not exist in this world. He could have sworn it had been a fairly popular class in Mob-Ion. That was a problem. Second asked whether she knew of any skills that combined sorcery and archery. Sylvia shook her head. Second dismissed the matter, saying that such a class definitely existed somewhere, and that was what she would be aiming for. Still looking confused, Sylvia reluctantly agreed. Second instructed her to first acquire the fundamental archery skills from the library. After that, they would head to the forest, where he would help her obtain the swordsmanship skills that were also required. Sylvia looked utterly bewildered. Second couldn't help thinking that it somehow felt like he was teaching a complete beginner the fundamentals of Mob-Ion all over again. He simply told her to follow him. Sylvia kept her eyes fixed on him. Noticing her gaze, Second looked back questioningly. Sylvia smiled and nodded in agreement. For a brief moment, Second was caught off guard by her sweet smile. Later in the forest, Sylvia was completely stunned. How could he possibly know such things? Second calmly asked why she seemed so upset. Sylvia insisted that she was not angry at all. She was simply dumbfounded. Methods for acquiring skills like bishop archery and castle archery were among the most closely guarded secrets imaginable. Such knowledge had been passed down among noble families for generations and was never meant to be shared. After hearing that, Second finally understood. So that was why the average levels in this world were so low. He muttered to himself that nobles really did enjoy their exclusive privileges. Sylvia warned him that if the nobles ever found out he was revealing secrets like these, he would be tortured to death. Second simply asked her to keep the information to herself. Sylvia pointed out that if she started using such advanced archery techniques, everyone would immediately realize something was strange. What an idiot. Second calmly replied that, in that case, she simply shouldn't use them in public. Sylvia paused. That was actually true. After that, Second continued bringing Sylvia along despite her constantly bombarding him with questions wherever they went. Under his guidance, she successfully acquired knight archery, silver general archery, gold general archery, and bishop archery. Just like Second, she managed to learn all of them without any particular difficulty. Inside the cave, Sylvia wiped the sweat from her forehead. She admitted that it already felt as though she had experienced an entire lifetime's worth of surprises in a single day. Second casually remarked that it was still far too early to be surprised. Sylvia flinched. He then asked how she thought he had managed to raise his EXP so quickly. The next instant, hundreds of bottles of high potions were transferred into her inventory. Sylvia stared at them in complete shock. There were so many incredibly expensive potions. Wait, no way. She immediately asked if he was seriously expecting her to shove every single one of them up her rear. Second quickly denied it, saying that he had never said anything like that. They were going to use them for the DK tactic. Sylvia repeated the unfamiliar term in confusion. Meanwhile, Second thought to himself that the loudest scream of surprise today was about to echo throughout the cave. Just as he expected, Sylvia's astonished cry reverberated across the cavern. Later, they returned to town. While they were eating, Second asked Sylvia whether she wanted to learn castle archery. Sylvia hesitantly replied that if it was truly possible, then she certainly wanted to learn it, but before she could finish, Second immediately declared that it was settled. They would be heading into a dungeon that very day. Sylvia was stunned. A dungeon? Second explained to himself that they would be exploring a second-rank dungeon known as Royce. Dungeons were divided into 3 ranks. First-rank dungeons were for experts. Second-rank dungeons were for intermediate adventurers. Third-rank dungeons were intended for beginners. There were 2 reasons for entering the intermediate-ranked Royce dungeon. The first was its conquest reward. The dungeon boss was a giant wolf-like monster known as the Flame Wolf, and it had a chance of dropping a rare weapon called the Flame Wolf Bow. It was an exceptional longbow imbued with the fire element, and Second absolutely intended to obtain it. The second, and more important, reason was Sylvia's acquisition of castle archery. That was their true objective. The monsters needed to fulfill the skills acquisition requirements appeared inside this dungeon. In short, this expedition had 2 goals: searching for rare drops while simultaneously completing the requirements needed to acquire castle archery. Sylvia cautiously observed her surroundings, remaining on full alert. Suddenly, Second announced that he had found what they were looking for. Sylvia gasped. Second explained that these were the monsters they had come to hunt. He instructed Sylvia to defeat them using Silver General Archery as effectively as she could. If she still wasn't accustomed to it, she should practice combining Night Archery with Silver General Archery. Sylvia immediately got into position. Without hesitation, she drew the string of her longbow, carefully took aim at one of the monsters, and released the arrow. The monster was defeated instantly. Sylvia froze in place. Her voice trembled as she asked Second whether she had somehow become unbelievably strong. Second thought to himself that thanks to the DK tactic, Sylvia's EXP had skyrocketed. Both her Night Archery and Silver General Archery had already reached grade 1. Second smiled confidently and reminded her that he had promised this would happen. Sylvia's eyes widened. A bright smile spread across her face as she admitted that he had indeed kept his promise and thanked him. Seeing her smile, Second couldn't help thinking that she looked incredibly beautiful like this. Though normally, she acted nothing like this. Afterward, Sylvia became overflowing with excitement. She was in perfect condition and proved to be an extremely dependable support. She even seemed to have become unexpectedly enthusiastic. She declared that she was definitely going to become a magic archer. Just then, Second noticed something ahead. He immediately told Sylvia to stop. In his mind, he noted that nearly 6 hours had already passed since they had entered the Royce dungeon. There was now only one remaining requirement for Sylvia to acquire castle archery. The final requirement was to defeat 3 monsters consecutively with a single shot each, using a combination of Night Archery and Silver General Archery. Each monster had to have already attacked another player, reducing that player's HP by at least 50%, and the finishing shot had to be fired from a distance of at least 5 meters. The reason they had stopped here was simple. Their target monsters had appeared. The ground shook with every heavy step the gigantic creatures took. Second observed them calmly. The flaming trolls possessed tremendous attack power, but their smooth, shiny craniums were an incredibly obvious weak point. A direct headshot from Sylvia's grade 1 Silver General Archery should be enough to defeat one instantly. There were 3 flaming trolls standing before them. Perfect. Second turned to Sylvia and instructed her to use a combination of Night Archery and Silver General Archery to fire at their heads from at least 5 meters away. She was to wait for his signal before shooting. Sylvia nodded in understanding before asking what he intended to do. Second gave only a vague answer. He was simply going to embrace the inevitable. He reminded her not to lose her composure, no matter what happened. Sylvia immediately nodded once more. Second checked his status. His HP was completely full. Judging by the numbers, his VIT should allow him to survive 3 critical hits from the flaming trolls. Cold sweat trickled down his face as he desperately reassured himself. It was fine. Everything would be fine. No, it wasn't fine at all. This was terrifying, but this step was absolutely necessary for Sylvia to obtain castle archery. He had to steel himself. The next instant, a tremendous blow smashed into his face. His body was hurled through the air. Witnessing the impact, Sylvia cried out his name. Second crashed onto the ground. He coughed up blood. What kind of attack was that? He quickly checked his status. Even after taking such a devastating hit, his HP had only dropped by about a quarter. Damn. He wondered if his back teeth would recover. In Mob Ion, even losing an arm wasn't a problem. drinking a high potion would completely restore it. But there was no guarantee that worked the same way in this world. Second couldn't help questioning whether this had been a terrible idea. Even so, he forced himself back onto his feet. It wasn't over yet. Sylvia was still waiting for him. The enormous troll loomed over him. For an instant, terror rooted him to the spot. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to remain standing. He was the world's number one. The world's number one would never allow anyone to witness such a pathetic side of himself. Quietly, he whispered to himself. He would become the world's number one in this world as well. Even if he was only an alternate character. He was the world's number one. That throne belonged to him. It was his life. His very reason for existing. He would never surrender it to anyone. He was the world's number one. He repeated those words over and over in his mind until the fear gradually disappeared. Then he faced the flaming troll head-on. He braced himself for the next attack. The troll swung its massive weapon. The impact sent him flying into the cavern wall before he crashed heavily onto the ground. Ignoring the pain, Second immediately checked his HP. It had fallen to just below half. That was the signal. He called out for Sylvia to fire. Waiting at a safe distance, Sylvia calmly drew her bow. She released the arrow with flawless precision. The shot pierced the flaming troll's cranium. The monster collapsed instantly. A satisfied grin spread across Second's face. 2 more to go. The moment the troll fell, Sylvia rushed straight toward him. She furiously called him a fool. An absolute fool. After everything was over, Sylvia scolded him non-stop. Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued calling him an idiot. Meanwhile, Second simply kept grinning. After leaving the dungeon, Sylvia stared at her newly acquired skill in disbelief. She had really learned castle archery. She repeatedly exclaimed that it couldn't possibly be real. She excitedly called out to Second again and again. It was unbelievable. It was amazing. Watching her celebrate so wholeheartedly, Second smiled. An indescribable sense of satisfaction welled up deep within his heart. He truly felt that enduring all of that pain had been worth it. Now that he had gained a companion named Sylvia, his life as an alternate character in this parallel world was sure to become far more exciting. After recovering from everything that had happened, Second and Sylvia gathered themselves and continued deeper into the Royce dungeon. Only one challenge remained, the dungeon's final boss. Beyond the massive door lay the territory of the Flame Wolf, the ruler of the Royce dungeon. It possessed the enormous body of a wolf completely enveloped in blazing flames. Protected by a powerful flame barrier that granted it exceptional resistance to damage, the monster was widely regarded throughout Mabion as one of the most troublesome bosses to defeat. However, Second already had a strategy in mind. Having fought the Flame Wolf before, he knew there was a reliable way to reduce the fearsome boss to little more than a helpless target. The key was a technique known as stun locking, a famous cooperative strategy performed by 2 or more players. The plan was simple. Second would begin by attacking the Flame Wolf with bishop archery, drawing its attention toward himself. As the monster charged, he would knock it back with Gold General. Sylvia would then strike it with bishop archery, causing the Flame Wolf to rush toward her instead. She would repel it using Gold General, allowing Second to attack once more. By repeating the sequence over and over, the boss would be trapped in a continuous cycle of interruptions, leaving it unable to fight back effectively. Although the method seemed almost too straightforward, Second believed that its simplicity was exactly what made it the safest strategy available. The two entered the boss chamber and executed the plan flawlessly. The Flame Wolf was eventually defeated, though the battle still ended with both of them losing their lives. 3 weeks later, Sylvia successfully acquired castle archery. The only objective left was obtaining the rare weapon known as the Flame Wolf's Bow. Day after day, the pair repeatedly ventured into the Royce dungeon, defeating well over 100 flame wolves in search of the elusive drop. Their persistence was finally rewarded when the legendary bow appeared. To Sylvia's complete surprise, Second immediately handed the weapon to her instead of keeping it for himself. Since she intended to become a magic archer, he believed the bow belonged in her hands. He had already decided to leave archery behind and shift his focus towards sorcery, meaning he no longer had any plans to use it. Although hesitant to accept such a valuable weapon, Sylvia ultimately received it with heartfelt gratitude. During their conversation, Sylvia was caught off guard by Second's casual revelation that he intended to specialize in sorcery. Until that moment, she had never heard him mention changing his path again. After mastering archery and swordsmanship, he was now preparing to pursue magic as well. To her, his dream of becoming the strongest person in the world no longer seemed impossible, even if Second himself believed he still had a long journey ahead. With his decision made, Second turned the conversation toward his next objective. To learn advanced sorcery, he needed access to the Royal Academy of Magic. While the basic grimoire for the Oppo form could be found in ordinary libraries, the grimoires for the Raptor form and Coral form were kept almost exclusively within magical academies. Time was the greatest obstacle. Although he could enroll through the proper channels, There was no telling how long the admission process would take. Entering the academy as a student would eventually solve the problem, but waiting for enrollment would only delay his progress. If possible, he wanted to use someone's influence to obtain temporary permission to enter the academy and study its collection of grimoires immediately. Since Sylvia was the second daughter of the Virginia Knight family, Second wondered whether she could rely on her family's connections. Unfortunately, that possibility was quickly dismissed. Having been abandoned by her father because she lacked talent with the sword, Sylvia believed he would never grant a request made by someone he considered a disappointment. Even if she demonstrated her abilities as an archer now, she doubted it would change his opinion. Her father had earned his knighthood through his own swordsmanship, and he would likely view her decision to abandon the sword in favor of the bow as nothing more than running away from the path he valued. Listening to her explanation, Second realized that Sylvia's fear of confronting her father ran much deeper than he had expected. Since a direct approach seemed hopeless, he decided there was only one option left. He would deceive Sylvia's father. Although Sylvia immediately sensed that his brilliant idea would lead to trouble, Second confidently declared that they would put his deception strategy into action the very next day. The following day, events unfolded in a way that even Second had never anticipated. The moment they arrived, Sylvia's father, Noir, knelt before him with the utmost respect. Second could only stare in disbelief. His original plan had been incredibly simple. He intended to wear an expensive set of rare clothing, pretend to be a foreign noble, and persuade Noir into writing letters of recommendation that would grant them access to the Royal Academy of Magic. Instead, the deception had become far more successful than intended. Somehow, Noir had become completely convinced that Second was not merely a nobleman, but actual foreign royalty. Second could no longer understand how such an enormous misunderstanding had come into existence. For a brief moment, he even considered revealing the truth. However, after seeing how far things had already gone, he realized there was no turning back. Choosing to continue the act, he calmly explained that he had concealed his true identity because of certain circumstances. Noir accepted the explanation without the slightest hint of doubt and vowed never to reveal the secret to anyone. Seeing everything proceed even better than expected, Second silently admitted that his reckless gamble had somehow succeeded. With the deception firmly established, he finally prepared to present the two requests that had brought him there in the first place. Noir respectfully agreed to grant whatever requests Second wished to make. Reminding himself not to lose focus despite how gullible Sylvia's father seemed, Second decided to begin with the less important matter. His first request was to obtain a connection to the Royal Academy of Magic. Noir immediately replied that he could write a referral letter for Second to transfer into the academy as a first-year student. However, that was not what Second wanted. A formal transfer would take too long, and his only goal was to enter the academy briefly to read through its collection of grimoires. He therefore asked whether there was a way to arrange a much shorter stay. Noir suggested applying as a short-term exchange student instead. Second found the proposal ideal and considered how long the exchange should last. While he preferred to keep it as short as possible, he worried that 2 or 3 days would not be enough to locate the grimoires he needed. After giving it some thought, he settled on a 2-week stay and asked Noir to prepare the referral letter accordingly. With the first request settled, Second moved on to the more important matter. He explained that he had taken a liking to Sylvia because she possessed remarkable talent in both archery and sorcery, and he requested permission for her to accompany him on his journey. As Noir stared at him with great intensity, Second briefly worried that referring to himself as this lord might have sounded unnatural and feared he had overplayed his role. To his surprise, Noir instead became even more respectful, practically begging him to accept his daughter despite her shortcomings and giving him complete freedom to employ her however he wished. Although still confused by the overwhelming respect he was receiving, Second continued acting the part. He acknowledged that Sylvia lacked talent with the sword, but declared that her gifts in archery and sorcery would one day become renowned throughout the world. He further explained that she had already been borrowed from the Third Chivalric Order under a 2-year contract, and that once the contract expired, he intended to formally request that she remain by his side permanently. At that time, he hoped to receive Noir's full support. Noir readily agreed, stating that all he wished for was Sylvia's success. He vowed to remain at home and patiently await the day when news of her accomplishments would reach him. Meanwhile, Sylvia stood nearby with her face burning bright red from embarrassment. Secretly glancing at her, Second admitted to himself that he had not fully understood everything Noir had been saying, but judging from his reaction, he assumed everything had gone according to plan. Maintaining his noble persona until the very end, he praised the Virginia family spirit and declared that he would never forget them. Once they had finally left the estate, Sylvia immediately exploded with embarrassment and frustration, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Meanwhile, Second quietly reflected that although they had successfully secured access to the Royal Academy of Magic, the entire situation had escalated far beyond what he had expected. The deception had become much more serious than he originally intended, leaving him with the unsettling realization that deceiving people was not something anyone should take lightly. He reflected on his actions, if only a little. A week passed after the success of the deception. During that time, Second and Sylvia sold flame wolf pelts, gained experience points, and enjoyed a remarkably comfortable lifestyle. Most of their experience came from hunting slime-type monsters. Deep within the slime forest, located along the road leading from the royal capital to the mines, rare slimes with exceptionally high experience rewards occasionally appeared. Their greatest reward from these expeditions was an incredibly rare drop obtained from a holy slime, the recovery sorcery wand med. With a drop rate of only 0.05%, it was considered an ultra-rare item. Simply equipping the wand allowed anyone to cast recovery med, regardless of whether they had learned recovery sorcery. The item became even more extraordinary when used by characters with the healer growth type. For healers, the wand received a ++ enhancement, a second-tier boost that increased its effectiveness to approximately 2.5 times its normal power. Under that enhancement, recovery med could instantly restore at least half of the health of an intermediate-level individual, while even severe injuries such as broken teeth could be healed with negligible effort. Although neither Second nor Sylvia possessed the healer growth type and therefore could not benefit from the ++ enhancement, simply being able to cast recovery med without restriction was already an enormous advantage. Considering that a single high-grade healing potion cost 800,000 CL, reducing their dependence on such expensive consumables would save an incredible amount of money. Second regarded the Holy Slime's drop as an invaluable gift. After making the necessary preparations, Second informed Sylvia that it was finally time to head for the Royal Academy of Magic. Having spent the previous week gathering experience and valuable items, the two eventually arrived at the academy. After dismounting from their horses, they were greeted by a woman who had been waiting to welcome them. Second thanked the two professors for personally coming to receive them. One of them, a man, asked if it would be acceptable to address him simply as Second. After agreeing, Second introduced both himself and Sylvia, expressing his gratitude in advance for their guidance during the next 2 weeks. The woman then introduced herself as Paula Memento, the headmaster of the Royal Academy of Magic, while the man introduced himself as Kevin, the homeroom teacher of first-year Class A, the class that Second would attend during his exchange. Curious, Second asked whether Sylvia would also be assigned to Class A. Paula confirmed that she would. Since the two exchange students would be staying together in a residence rather than the academy dormitories, there was no reason to separate them into different classes. She also informed them that uniforms had already been prepared for both of them before leading them further into the academy. As Second followed the professors, he quietly observed that everything appeared to be proceeding smoothly. For the moment, no one seemed to suspect their true intentions. Nevertheless, he reminded himself that the next 2 weeks would require his complete concentration. Kevin explained that they would attend morning lessons that day, followed by a tour of the academy in the afternoon. Rather than guiding them personally, however, he revealed that a student from Class A had already been selected to show them around. Since the afternoons were generally reserved for self-study and outstanding students usually had enough free time to assist with such duties. Second thanked Kevin for the arrangement. In the back of his mind, however, he had already decided that once the afternoon tour began, he would gather as much information as possible from his guide, though his real objective was simply to learn the whereabouts of the grimoires. Professor Kevin then announced that they had arrived at Class A. Entering the classroom first, he greeted the students and reminded them that, as previously announced, 2 exchange students would be joining their class for the next 2 weeks. He then invited Second and Sylvia inside. The moment they entered, every student's attention turned toward them. Second introduced himself, explaining that he had come from the island nation of Zipong to experience the academy and expressing his hope that everyone would get along with him. The girls immediately reacted to his appearance, unable to hide their admiration as his smile captivated the entire classroom. Sylvia then introduced herself as Sylvia Virginia and shyly expressed her hope of getting along with everyone as well. After their introductions, Kevin directed the two of them to their seats. While the girls continued stealing glances at Second, the boys found themselves equally captivated by Sylvia's striking beauty. Since it was a special occasion, Kevin decided to spend the lesson reviewing the fundamentals once again. Meanwhile, Second's thoughts remained fixed on his real objective. He wondered whether 2 weeks would truly be enough time to learn the sorceries he needed. Once the lesson ended, he intended to begin gathering information immediately. As soon as class was dismissed, Second approached Professor Kevin and politely requested to meet the student who would be showing him around the academy that afternoon. He also mentioned wanting to share a meal together and become better acquainted with the guide. Kevin gladly agreed before calling over a student named Maine. After the boy arrived, Kevin explained that although the schedule had been moved forward slightly, he would like Maine to show Second around the academy, including the cafeteria. Maine readily accepted the request. Second then asked whether he could also ask questions about sorcery during the tour. Rather than forcing information out of someone later, he preferred to ask permission in advance. Kevin assured him there would be no problem, explaining that Maine was the representative of the first-year students. Hearing that, Second silently smiled to himself. If Main truly served as the class representative, then he would likely possess exactly the information Second needed. The opportunity could hardly have been better. The two greeted each other, agreeing to get along during the tour. Seeing that Main showed no sign of being cautious around him, Second became even more confident that he could naturally steer the conversation toward the grimoires. Before leaving, he informed Sylvia, who had become surrounded by curious classmates, that they were heading to the cafeteria. After excusing herself from the group, Sylvia hurried over and apologized for making him wait. However, the instant she noticed Main standing beside Second, she froze in shock. Her reaction immediately revealed that Main held a far higher status than Second had realized. Main calmly explained that everyone's status was equal within the academy and requested that he simply be treated like any other student. Embarrassed, Sylvia quickly corrected herself and addressed him more appropriately. Only then did Second realize that Main was actually a prince. The revelation caught him completely off guard. He had imagined that royalty would behave arrogantly, demanding respect and obedience. Yet Main displayed the exact opposite attitude, politely insisting on being treated as an equal. Deciding to follow his wishes, Second accepted the situation without further thought. Without warning, Main grabbed Second's hand and led him toward the cafeteria. Looking down at their joined hands, Second found the situation increasingly strange. Main had shown almost no reaction toward the beautiful Sylvia, yet he seemed remarkably assertive toward him instead. An uncomfortable suspicion slowly formed in Second's mind. The thought bothered him enough that he decided the only way to settle the matter was to ask directly. Never had he imagined that the day would come when a prince would make him feel so uneasy. Gathering his courage, Second suddenly stopped walking and bluntly questioned whether Main preferred men. The unexpected question left Main completely stunned. He immediately denied the accusation, insisting that Second had misunderstood everything and that he was completely straight. Accepting the answer without pressing the issue further, Second calmly let the matter drop. At that moment, a small girl accidentally bumped into him while passing by. Looking down, he found no one standing there. He glanced around in confusion, wondering whether he had only imagined the collision. Meanwhile, the tiny girl quietly continued on her way, secretly admiring how unbelievably handsome he was. With shining eyes, Main openly admitted that he had taken a liking to Second. Sylvia stared at Second in disbelief as he responded with complete confidence, carrying himself with the pride of someone who believed he was destined to become the strongest in the world. Rather than being offended, Main became even more delighted. It was the first time he had ever met someone so straightforward. Ever since enrolling in the Royal Academy of Magic, he had looked forward to the idea that everyone would be treated equally regardless of status. However, reality had been disappointing, whether at the Royal Palace or within the Academy itself. Everyone continued to see him only as the kingdom's second prince. Very few people acknowledged him as an ordinary individual, and he believed that only his mother truly saw him for who he was. Second regarded the situation as a rather common story, earning an immediate scolding from Sylvia for his bluntness. Main quickly intervened, reassuring her that there was no need to apologize. After all, this was the same person who had asked him moments after learning he was a prince whether he preferred men. Compared to that, a little bluntness hardly mattered anymore. Setting the matter aside, Second immediately asked the question that interested him most: the location of the Academy's grimoires. Main explained that the library contained grimoires for both the Oppo form and the Raptor form. The Coeurl form was also kept there, although borrowing it required permission from the head librarian. As for the fourth form, Second interrupted before Main could finish. To his surprise, the Academy did not possess it. Main explained that he had seen the fourth form grimoire only once before, and it was currently safeguarded within the royal palace. Receiving exactly the information he needed, Second silently committed it to memory. Soon afterward, Main resumed guiding them around the Academy. His tour was so thorough and courteous that by the time they finally reached the library, the destination Second had truly been waiting for. The sun had already set, and the building had closed for the day. Main informed them that all students were free to use the library and encouraged them to return first thing the following morning before cheerfully bidding them farewell. After watching him leave, Second let out a deep sigh, feeling as though the entire afternoon had left his shoulders stiff. Sylvia remarked that she was the one who deserved to complain. Ignoring the comment, Second immediately informed her that beginning the next day, she would practically live inside the library studying fire magic. Since mastering sorcery was essential for becoming a true magic archer, he intended for her to learn at least the Raptor form and the Coeurl form of fire magic, allowing her to fully utilize the Flame Wolf's bow, whose abilities were naturally aligned with fire. Just then, loud laughter echoed from nearby. Hidden behind a nearby wall, Second and Sylvia overheard several students gossiping about the Academy's newest exchange students. The conversation quickly shifted to Main. The students mocked him relentlessly, ridiculing his personality and speculating about his relationship with the newcomers. They laughed at how isolated he always seemed, claiming that despite insisting everyone ignore his royal status, he still came across as condescending and sarcastic. According to them, it was no surprise that he had no friends. Listening from their hiding place, Second realized that Main had been enduring isolation all along. The ridicule sounded far more like bullying than harmless gossip. Quietly, he began reconsidering his own plans. If becoming friends with Main could also lead to establishing connections with the Castall royal family, perhaps he could eventually gain access to the fourth form grimoire kept inside the royal palace. Convincing himself that he had no other choice, Second decided he would become the prince's friend. Meanwhile, the gossip only grew more vicious. The students accused Main of using his wealth and royal influence to alter his grades, condemned him for pretending to be an exemplary honor student, and mocked his growing friendship with the exchange students, dismissing all of them as worthless trash who belonged together. Their insults even spread to another student they referred to as a failure. The laughter continued until one of the boys casually glanced to the side and froze. Sylvia was standing directly in front of them. Watching the scene unfold, Second stared in surprise as she silently confronted the group herself. The man gasped in shock as he realized it was the exchange student. Sylvia glared at him furiously, accusing him of discriminating against beast folk. The man stood frozen in silence. Sylvia repeated her accusation, demanding to know if that was truly beast folk discrimination. The other man hurriedly denied it, explaining that she probably did not know, but there was a loser in Class F named Iko Leaflet. The first man quickly supported his explanation, insisting that Iko was simply incompetent and happened to be a beast folk by coincidence, so they were not discriminating against beast folk in general. Sylvia replied that if that were true, then they should explain why they had called both Secondano and her trash. The two men immediately broke into a cold sweat. One of them nervously suggested that she would surely understand if they explained. Without warning, Sylvia smashed both of them on the head with her fist. By the time they realized it, it was already too late. The two men immediately fled. Sylvia smiled in satisfaction, proudly declaring that justice had been served. As she puffed out her chest in triumph, Second suggested that they head back. However, Second found himself thinking about the name the man had mentioned earlier, Iko Leaflet, the so-called beast folk loser. For now, he decided he should remember that name. The following afternoon, Second headed straight to the library. He asked the librarian if he could read the grimoires for the raptor form of every element. The librarian happily agreed and asked him to wait a moment. Shortly afterward, she returned with the grimoires he had requested. Second began with the fire raptor form grimoire. After scanning through its contents, he closed the book and moved on to the next one. He handed the finished grimoire to Sylvia. Sylvia stared at him in disbelief, wondering if he had already finished. Second calmly replied that he had already acquired it. Sylvia could only mutter to herself that it was just another ordinary day for him. While Sylvia watched in amazement, Second casually flipped through the remaining 3 grimoires just as quickly before handing each of them to her. With all 4 grimoires finished, he declared that he had learned everything. Sylvia let out a sigh, wondering whether she could even learn all of that within 2 weeks. She asked Secondano if he had any tricks or secrets that could help her. The word tricks immediately made Second pause. There were few words he hated more than tricks, secrets, or key points. Back in his previous life, after becoming the world's #1 player, beginners had constantly pestered him with questions about shortcuts. They always wanted to know if he had any tricks to become stronger or hidden methods for improving their skills. Those selfish requests had left him with nothing but unpleasant memories. Even after arriving in this world, he found himself hearing that same word once again. Surprisingly, however, it did not sound unpleasant this time. Sylvia was only asking because she was worried that she would become a burden if she failed to master the skills within 2 weeks. She had swallowed her pride and sincerely relied on him. That consideration genuinely pleased him. This was nothing like the shallow relationships he had experienced over the internet. This was a sincere human connection. The difference between this world and his previous life was immeasurable. Rather than feeling annoyed, he found himself genuinely happy that someone was relying on him. Second moved closer to Sylvia. Originally, he had intended for them to study separately that day, but he decided to change his plans. He would personally teach her instead. As their shoulders lightly brushed against each other, Sylvia blushed. For the first time in his life, Second experienced genuine happiness from teaching someone. He sat beside Sylvia, who looked both apologetic and delighted. Her cheeks gradually turned bright red as they studied side by side. Second patiently taught her until enough time had passed for him to decide that they should stop for the day. As he reflected on the lesson, he realized that this had been the first time he had seriously examined the contents of the grimoires. They were unbelievably verbose and difficult to understand. Compared to reading books like these, studying practical information would have been 10,000 times more effective. Instead, he explained practical knowledge to Sylvia. He taught her what each spell actually did, how it should be used, how magical power was calculated, how cooldowns changed with each rank, and countless other useful details similar to the information found on a game wiki. Partway through the lesson, Sylvia wondered if she was expected to memorize all of it. To Second, that was only natural. Back in his previous life, this kind of information had been the only thing he had ever seriously studied. No one had studied the game Mob Ion more thoroughly than he had. Knowledge that had been completely useless in real life had now become one of his greatest weapons. That realization made him genuinely happy. Second asked whether she had managed to learn everything. Sylvia apologized and admitted that she wanted to study it a little longer. Second told her not to worry. Afterward, he suggested that they head back. While they were walking, a girl suddenly hurried toward them. Second stopped and turned toward her, wondering if she was talking to him. The girl pointed directly at him before introducing herself as Ichii Leaflet and asking for his name. The moment he heard her name, Second immediately remembered the conversation from the previous day. So this was Ichii Leaflet. He introduced himself in return. After hearing his name, Ichii peeked from behind him and looked at Sylvia. Sylvia politely introduced herself. Ichii cheerfully greeted her before grabbing Sylvia's hand and enthusiastically shaking it. Second could not help but think that such an innocent and harmless-looking girl was being bullied. It was outrageous, completely unforgivable. He asked Ichii whether anything had been troubling her. After thinking for a moment, she answered that nothing in particular was wrong. Second quietly accepted her answer before telling her that if anything ever troubled her, she should come to him. He promised that he would somehow help her. Ichii's face instantly brightened with happiness. Second then noticed the large pile of books behind her and asked about them. Ichii cheerfully explained that everyone had asked her to carry them. Second immediately understood, so she had become everyone's errand runner. He asked whether she could really handle everything by herself. Ichii proudly replied that she was strong enough to manage it. Second casually offered to help her carry the books. Ichii looked surprised that he was willing to help. Second insisted that he would personally help her and jokingly remarked that it was a rare opportunity, so she should feel honored. Ichii stared at him for a brief moment before smiling gratefully. However, she politely declined. When Second wondered why, Ichii explained that carrying things was the only thing she was good at. She wanted to keep helping everyone because she believed that if she became much more useful, everyone would eventually treat her kindly. The moment he heard those words, Second froze. His fists slowly clenched as anger filled his heart. He wanted to stop her. Those words should never have been spoken. Ichii cheerfully waved goodbye before pushing the cart loaded with books away. As he watched her disappear into the distance, Second's expression darkened. Those earnest efforts that desperately continued turning without ever connecting reminded him of something. He knew that pain better than anyone. It was pointless. Playing online games never produced anything meaningful. Even after working harder than anyone else and becoming the world's #1 player, it had still been nothing more than an online game. Risking one's entire life for something like that had been utterly meaningless. He had questioned over and over how pointless his efforts had been. He had wondered how foolish, worthless, pathetic, and hopeless he truly was. Those thoughts had consumed him until he eventually died in despair. Then, by an unbelievable miracle, he had arrived in this world. People called it the blessing of the gods. Someone as hopeless as he had somehow been saved. But could anyone honestly believe that a miracle like that would also happen for Ichii? He understood her feelings more deeply than anyone else. Precisely because he understood them, he wanted to save her with his own hands. Sylvia's voice interrupted his thoughts, bringing him back to reality. That night, inside his room, Second continued thinking about Ichii. If she truly was incompetent, then why had she been admitted into the prestigious Royal Academy of Magic? This academy was renowned throughout the kingdom. Anyone capable of enrolling there should possess considerable magical talent and be able to use numerous kinds of magic. After thinking about it throughout the entire night, he arrived at only one conclusion. The following morning, Second told Sylvia that he wanted to recruit Ichii Leaflet. Sylvia's face instantly lit up with joy. She was delighted that her own thoughts matched his and considered herself fortunate. Before she could continue, Second stopped her, telling her not to kneel and start acting like a knight first thing in the morning. Sylvia admitted that she still did not know whether Ichii would accept. Second replied that even if Ichii refused, he would at least ask to see her status so he could give her advice about which path she should take. Sylvia agreed. Just then, the commotion ahead caught their attention. Ichii Leaflet was kneeling on the ground, covered in dirt. Both Second and Sylvia widened their eyes in shock. Sylvia immediately rushed over to her in concern. Meanwhile, an overwhelming sense of unease rose inside Second. Something was clearly wrong. Students continued walking past Ichii without offering any help. Everyone pretended not to see her. Everyone ignored her. Second could feel an indescribable hostility surrounding the scene. He called out to Ichii, asking what had happened and whether she was all right. Ichii brushed his hand away and desperately told him not to speak to her. Second froze. He recognized it immediately. He had encountered it once before. It was the vilest form of evil, the unmistakable scent of despair. Earlier, Iko had been carrying sacks and stacking them up. One of the nearby men snickered, commenting that she had gone out of her way to bring the mud that was about to be dumped on her. Another laughed, saying she truly was a fool. Iko paused in confusion. At that moment, a lump of mud struck her, covering her body in dirt. The men burst into laughter. In that instant, Iko was forced to face the reality she had avoided for so long. No matter how desperately she continued lying to herself, nothing would ever change. All of her efforts were completely futile. It was too painful to watch. Everyone should be allowed to have dreams. Iko's eyes froze. Suddenly, she sprang to her feet and ran away, desperately yelling at them to stay back. Sylvia and Second immediately chased after her. As he ran, Second reflected that he did not know exactly what had happened to her, but he understood one thing with certainty. Iko had finally realized it as well. Her efforts had been meaningless. Meanwhile, Second remarked that they had to save her. Iko continued running without looking back. Sylvia eventually caught up to her, but Iko forcefully slapped her hands away. Second continued pursuing her until they finally cornered her. Iko tearfully begged them to stay away, staring at them with frightened eyes. As he looked at her, Second estimated that nearly an hour had already passed. Sylvia was completely exhausted, yet Iko somehow still had stamina remaining. Sylvia gently reassured her that everything was all right and that they only wanted to talk. Iko refused, desperately telling them to leave her alone. Tears streamed endlessly down her face. Seeing that, Second could not help but think that leaving her alone now would accomplish nothing. She had already accepted defeat. Watching how desperately she had run and how forcefully she had pushed Sylvia away, Second quietly analyzed her abilities. She was slow, yet physically powerful. She possessed tremendous stamina. Most likely, her intelligence was extremely low, meaning her magical attack power was poor. It was a gamble, a tremendous gamble, but it was worth trying. Second drew his sword and quietly warned Sylvia not to panic. As he approached Iko, she desperately cried out once more for him to stay away. Without hesitation, Second raised his sword. Sylvia froze in disbelief. Iko also stared at him in complete confusion. Before either of them could react, Second severed his own arm with a single swing. Sylvia and Iko both froze in horror. Enduring the unbearable pain through gritted teeth, Second remained standing. Sylvia rushed toward him and angrily scolded him for being an idiot, but Second immediately ordered her to stay back. Unable to do anything else, Sylvia stopped, holding a wand in his remaining hand. Second reflected that if he could recruit Iko into his party here, he would move one step closer to becoming the world's #1. That was because he had finally realized what Iko truly was. He handed the wand to Iko and told her that recovery sorcery suited her. He instructed her to equip the wand and heal his arm. In his mind, he concluded that Iko's growth type was Paladin. Iko stared at him speechlessly before shaking her head in panic, crying that she could not do it. The wand Second had given her was the recovery sorcery wand Med, an extremely rare wand dropped by holy slimes. As long as someone equipped it, they could use the recovery spell Recovery Med. However, if the user's growth type belonged to the healer class, the wand's double plus bonus effect would activate, dramatically increasing its healing power. If Iko truly was a paladin, its healing capability would become powerful enough to instantly regenerate his severed arm. Looking down at his wound, Second groaned in pain and urged Iko to hurry. Startled, Iko continued shaking her head in hesitation. Second raised his voice, insisting that there were no excuses and telling her that she could do it. He urged her to hurry. Realizing she had no other choice, Iko finally accepted the wand and quietly agreed. In his heart, Second encouraged her. That was right. She had to do it. She needed to believe that she could save someone. She needed to realize that this was the path that would save her as well. Tears still flowing from her eyes, Iko raised the wand towards Second's severed arm. The wand suddenly emitted a brilliant light. She desperately wished for his arm to heal. In the next instant, Second's arm regenerated completely. Looking at his restored arm, he quietly murmured that it had returned to normal. Iko's knees gave out beneath her as she stared at the miraculous sight in complete disbelief. At that very moment, Second's body suddenly lost strength and collapsed to the ground. Barely conscious, he apologized that he could not hold on any longer before losing consciousness completely. Sylvia immediately rushed to his side in panic. As darkness overtook him, Second realized that although injuries and HP could be restored in this world, physical exhaustion did not recover nearly as quickly. He reflected on how he had identified Iko's growth type while chasing after her. She was slow, physically strong, possessed tremendous stamina, and despite attending a magic academy, she was hopeless at magic. That meant her intelligence was abnormally low. She was completely unsuited to becoming a sorceress. Her dexterity was also too low for archery. Although her strength was respectable, her poor agility prevented her from maneuvering effectively. Even with her low intelligence, however, she possessed an enormous amount of MP. Looking only at those characteristics, she seemed completely hopeless. Yet many top-ranked players had deliberately chosen this exact growth type. Every famous party almost always included a paladin. The reason was simple. Paladins specialized in using their immense HP, SP, and vitality to master shield arts. They stood as an unbreakable wall for their companions, absorbing attacks from monsters all by themselves. Whenever they took damage, they immediately healed themselves with recovery sorcery. As long as they still had MP remaining, they could continue standing as an impenetrable shield. If Iko became his ally, then together with Paladin Iko, his own all-round abilities, and Sylvia as a magic archer, they would finally have a perfectly balanced front line, middle line, and rear guard. Such a team would bring him dramatically closer to becoming the world's #1. More than anything else, he wanted Iko to become his companion. Second was trying to make use of her. He wanted Iko to become his ally because he was certain she would be invaluable once she mastered recovery sorcery. Thinking back, he realized he had done the same thing with Sylvia. He had taken advantage of the emptiness in her heart, forcefully persuading her to join him. He had deliberately drawn out her sympathy and guided her toward becoming his companion. Even so, he genuinely wanted her to follow him. Quietly, Second pleaded for Iko to come with him. Slowly, he regained consciousness and found himself lying in a room. Sylvia immediately rushed to his side, crying out in relief that he was finally awake. She grabbed his hand and told him not to overdo things. If he lost that hand, he would never become the world's #1. Second gently called her name before awkwardly pointing out that she was holding his right hand, while it had actually been his left hand that was cut off. Sylvia's face instantly turned bright red with embarrassment. She quickly let go of his hand and let out a long sigh before remarking that he had given her quite the scare. Second remained silent for a moment before smiling faintly. He casually brushed it off, telling her it was not a big deal and asking her not to worry about him. Sylvia repeated his words in disbelief. Not worry about him? That should have been her line. She reminded him that both she and Iko had been saved by him. No one else had rescued them. They had been saved by Secondano. She herself had been trapped in a completely hopeless situation until he had reached out to her so effortlessly. There was no reason for him to worry about anything anymore. She declared that she would become his knight and follow him to the ends of the earth. With a gentle smile, Sylvia quietly left the room. Sitting up on his bed, Second wondered if she had heard him talking in his sleep. No, that was probably not it. More likely, Sylvia had seen through him from the very beginning. She had probably realized that he had tried to take advantage of her weakness and use her for his own goals. She had probably even noticed the guilt and uncertainty he secretly carried because of it. Even so, she had willingly declared that she would follow him. She truly was a good girl. Just then, the door burst open with a loud bang, startling Second. Someone rushed into the room while loudly calling his name. Turning toward the entrance, he saw Iko standing there. She immediately ran to him, wrapped her arms tightly around him, and repeatedly apologized. Second gently patted her head before telling her once again that recovery sorcery suited her. He urged her to quit the academy and join him instead. Deep inside, Second knew this was the perfect opportunity to recruit Iko for his own benefit. Even so, he firmly believed that following him would also become her salvation. Iko looked at him with sparkling eyes and asked whether she could really be useful to him. Smiling, Second answered that she absolutely could. He invited her to travel with him. However, Iko's cheerful expression quickly faded as hesitation filled her face. Seeing that, Second asked whether there was a reason she could not leave the academy. Startled, Iko wondered how he had known. Second simply grinned and proudly claimed that he was the world's #1 before encouraging her to tell him everything. Clenching her fists, Iko slowly began explaining her past. She had been born in a beastfolk village far from the royal capital. Ever since childhood, she had possessed an absurdly large amount of MP, and her father proudly bragged about it to everyone. Before long, the villagers began believing that Iko must surely possess extraordinary talent for sorcery. That hope continued spreading throughout the village until, the previous year, everyone pooled together their savings to enroll her in the prestigious Royal Academy of Magic. They believed that if a prodigy from their small beastfolk village became a distinguished sorceress, it would bring prosperity and recognition to the entire village. As for how she had passed the entrance examination, the answer was simple. Although Iko's growth type left her intelligence abnormally low, she had no trouble learning magic itself. In fact, she excelled at understanding it. She had already mastered the raptor form along with both the wind and earth elements. However, because her intelligence was disastrously low, the actual power of her spells was not even half that of the other students. As a result, everyone regarded her as a failure. That was precisely why she could not quit. She could never betray the expectations of her entire village. After hearing everything, Second quietly reflected on what those expectations had truly given her. They had done nothing except place an unbearable burden upon the shoulders of a single lonely girl. Even now, that burden continued crushing her heart. Second gently reassured her that everything would be all right because he had already prepared an escape route for her. Iko looked at him in confusion. Second told her that she could simply run away. Unlike his own past, she already had a way out standing right in front of her. Iko quietly repeated his words, wondering what he meant by an escape route. Second smiled and told her once again not to worry. Had she not heard him? He was going to become the world's #1. The world's #1. Surely she understood what that meant. Iko stared at him with complete confusion, clearly having no idea what he meant. Second explained that it meant becoming the strongest person alive, someone with no equal anywhere in the world. She would become one of his companions. Was there anything more prestigious than that? Compared to becoming a member of his party, the Royal Academy of Magic was insignificant. Even becoming a royal court sorceress was nothing special. He was certain the villagers would be overjoyed. No, they would celebrate for 3 days and 3 nights. They would build a bronze statue of Iko in the very center of the village and pass down stories of her greatness for generations. It would become a legendary honor. When she finally returned home, everyone would kneel before her with tears in their eyes. Hearing such an absurd image, Iko could not stop herself from laughing. Second continued dramatically, announcing that the glorious Iko-sama had finally returned. According to him, that was exactly what the village chief would say first. Her father would probably be begging her to get Second-sama's autograph as well. Watching him imitate everyone with complete seriousness, Iko burst into laughter once again. Tears gathered in her eyes as she laughed wholeheartedly. Seeing her finally smile from the bottom of her heart, Second quietly smiled as well. After a short while, Iko gently called out to him and told him that she wanted to go with him. Second smiled in response. And just like that, the beastfolk paladin, Iko Leaflet, became his ally. Second instructed Iko to withdraw from the academy starting that very day. He also told her to obtain permission to enroll in Class A as his attendant. Iko immediately acknowledged his instructions. The 3 of them then headed together to the headmaster's office. Paula, the headmaster, asked them to give her a little time. Second agreed and asked how long they should wait. The headmaster explained that she would hold an emergency staff meeting during lunch and that a decision would be made afterward. Second replied that he would look forward to hearing the good news before politely excusing himself. The 3 of them then left the office. Once they were outside, Sylvia asked Second why he had made such a request. Second admitted that it might seem unrealistic, but he believed there was a high chance it would be approved. Sylvia wondered why. Second explained that they were exchange students, and more importantly, he was a noble from a foreign country who had personally witnessed the bullying of a beastfolk student. Sylvia quietly realized what he meant. If Zippong was known as a country that treated beastfolk kindly, then Second finished her thought by saying that the academy would recognize it as a serious problem. Even if they did not truly care, the situation created an extremely poor impression. Furthermore, the staff had already cornered themselves into a position where they could not openly admit they had ignored the bullying. The last thing they wanted was for the issue to grow any larger. They would naturally prefer to resolve everything peacefully. Therefore, approving his request was the obvious choice. Hearing his explanation, Iko gasped in amazement and praised him for being so smart. Wearing a smug expression, Second proudly replied that it was because he was the world's #1. Afterward, they headed toward the cafeteria. Along the way, May noticed them and called out to Second. He mentioned that he had already heard the news and asked whether Second was making Iko his attendant. Second frowned, wondering how the information had already spread. Had the rumor circulated throughout the academy in only half a day? Gently patting Iko's head, Second declared that she possessed exceptional talent for recovery sorcery, and the academy's inability to recognize that merely demonstrated the school's true nature. Maine burst into laughter at Second's blunt remark, commenting that Second was exactly the same as always and adding that he truly loved his straightforward personality. Upon hearing the words truly loved, Second looked at Maine strangely and began wondering whether he really. Before he could finish the thought, Sylvia smacked him on the back and firmly cut him off. Iko looked completely bewildered while Maine simply smiled innocently. Just then, Professor Kevin approached and greeted them. Second immediately asked whether a decision had been made. Kevin replied that the request had been approved without any objections. Starting that very day, Iko would attend Class A as Second Dano's attendant. Satisfied, Second expressed his gratitude. Kevin then excused himself and departed. As he watched him leave, Second reflected that Professor Kevin had been wise enough not to ask unnecessary questions, such as why Iko had to become an attendant or why she had to transfer to Class A. If he had asked, Second would have answered with biting sarcasm that it was so Iko would never be bullied again. Sylvia then asked in surprise why Second had insisted on placing Iko in Class A. Internally, Second reminded himself that he had a female knight who could sometimes be incredibly dense. Iko also asked the same question, wondering why she had to move. Second thought that saying it was simply to protect her from bullying would have been the easiest explanation. However, the real reason was different. He had briefly considered taking revenge on everyone who had bullied Iko, but Iko herself had not wanted that. All she truly wanted was to stay by his side. Seeing both Sylvia and Iko waiting for an answer, Second thought for a moment before quietly replying that it was because she was his comrade. After finishing their meal, the three of them headed to the library. Second reminded himself that the exchange period was limited. He needed Sylvia to master sorcery as quickly as possible. 1 week passed. His patient, detailed, and thorough lessons gradually began producing results. Sylvia successfully learned the fire raptor form in only 3 days. Furthermore, Second noticed that she had begun grasping the underlying principles behind sorcery. Sylvia even excitedly remarked that she somehow felt capable of learning the Kouryaku form as well. Hearing that, they immediately borrowed the Kouryaku form grimoires for all 4 elements from the librarian. Since it was a perfect opportunity, Second decided to learn all 4 of them himself as well. Sylvia worked tirelessly, constantly muttering that she was almost there. She remained seated in the library for hours, studying so intensely that she almost looked possessed. By then, Second had already taught Sylvia everything she needed to know, making those days considerably more relaxing. They even spent their free time lying comfortably on the grass. Main occasionally joined them, and together they peacefully enjoyed those pleasant days. On the surface, it appeared that Second was doing very little. In reality, however, he had a clear objective. He wanted to become closer to Main. Although he believed he had already made significant progress, he still felt that it was not quite enough. The reason was simple. He wanted the grimoires of the 4th form. Main had previously mentioned that the 4th form grimoires were kept inside the royal palace. In the first-rank dungeon, Algin, each elemental 4th form grimoire had roughly a 10% chance of dropping from the dungeon boss. Although Algin was considered the easiest first-rank dungeon, the current party consisting of himself, Sylvia, and Iko was still nowhere near capable of clearing it. That was precisely why he had been trying to strengthen his relationship with Main. His goal was to reach the point where he could simply ask Main to take him into the royal palace. At that moment, Iko approached while holding a document and asked what it was. Looking at her, Second suddenly realized something he had overlooked until now. Iko was not actually very literate. More accurately, she struggled with the common Japanese used throughout this world. Thinking back, he remembered that in Ma-Bayon, aside from important NPCs, beast folk normally spoke their own language. That meant Iko had specifically learned Japanese just to attend this academy. Despite the tremendous handicap of constantly reading grimoires with the help of a dictionary, she had somehow managed to master both the wind and earth raptor forms. Unfortunately, because her intelligence was so low, she still could not use either of them effectively. If anything, despite appearing foolish on the surface, she might actually possess remarkable intelligence. Second quickly dismissed the thought, deciding it was probably just his imagination. He took the document from Iko and looked it over. The headline announced that applications were now being accepted for the 51st Sorcery Convention. He explained to Iko that it appeared to be an annual magic tournament, and that the champion would receive a prize. Curious, Iko asked what the prize was. Second continued reading the notice. The instant his eyes landed on the reward, his entire body froze. The grand prize was the chase ring. He read the announcement again just to make certain he had not misread it. His body began trembling with excitement. Turning toward Iko with burning determination in his eyes, Second declared that they were going to participate in the sorcery convention. Second reflected on the chase ring, a poorly named yet extraordinarily powerful accessory. Its base effect granted a 10% chance of triggering an additional attack after casting sorcery, effectively functioning as a double attack effect. While that ability appeared simple, it possessed an incredible hidden potential. Many people underestimated the accessory because of its modest initial effect. However, they failed to realize that it could be upgraded by 3 levels. If someone established a good relationship with a high-ranking blacksmith capable of performing ability upgrades, the chase ring could evolve into something truly monstrous. Once upgraded to its maximum level, the chance of triggering an additional attack increased from 10% to 25%. Naturally, an item with such an extraordinary hidden ability was extremely rare. During the days of Ma-Bayon, it had been worth 1.5 billion CL. In this world, however, its exact value remained unknown. Regardless of the price, Second had already decided that he would obtain it by any means necessary. Fortunately, the sorcery convention was scheduled to begin on the final day of the exchange program. As a foreigner with an unusual interest in grimoires, attracting too much attention by freely using the raptor and Kouryaku forms would inevitably arouse suspicion. Even so, as long as they withdrew quickly after achieving their objective, they should be able to manage. The day before the sorcery convention, Second asked Main whether he would be participating. Main explained that, as the second prince, attending was one of his responsibilities. In return, he asked whether Second would also be participating. When Second confirmed that he would, Sylvia reacted with complete surprise, nearly spitting out her drink. She immediately pointed out that she had never heard anything about his participation. Second casually remarked that there was no reason for her to know, since he had never mentioned it. Main let out a heavy sigh. Noticing his reaction, Second asked whether there was something about the sorcery convention that bothered him. Main admitted that his older brother would also be attending. Second immediately understood that he was referring to the first prince and wondered whether Main disliked him. Main denied it, explaining that he simply had difficulty dealing with his brother. The first prince valued talent above everything else. Although Main possessed exceptional talent in sorcery, his brother excelled in swordsmanship and constantly mocked him as a weakling while looking down on him. Furthermore, regardless of Main's intentions, the first prince viewed him as a rival in the struggle for the throne and therefore considered him a threat. Although the first prince would officially attend the convention as the commander of the first chivalric order, Main believed that his true purpose was to publicly humiliate him before the gathered audience. Upon hearing this, Second realized that the first prince truly was the commander of the first chivalric order. From everything he had heard, the first prince sounded like an unpleasant individual. Second glanced quietly at Sylvia. Everything suddenly made sense. The first prince was likely one of the corrupt members of the chivalric order's upper ranks who had previously harassed Sylvia. If that were true, then he stood above all of them. Second wondered whether Main could simply avoid attending by pretending to be ill. Main explained that doing so would only provide his older brother with another excuse to ridicule him publicly, portraying him as a cowardly and incompetent prince who attended a magic academy yet lacked the courage to appear at the sorcery convention. Second could only conclude that life as a prince was far more painful than it appeared. The conversation eventually shifted when Sylvia mentioned that she had successfully acquired the Kouryaku form earlier that morning. Second was genuinely surprised, as it was the first time he had heard about it. Sylvia simply reminded him that she had never told him. Second silently accepted the perfect retaliation, realizing that she had used his own earlier words against him. Meanwhile, Iko remained completely absorbed in eating her meal. The following day, the sorcery convention finally began. Second sat quietly in his assigned seat, with a serious expression while listening to conversations around him. Several nearby participants discussed the tournament's prize, mentioning that it was supposedly a ring, although none of them had ever heard of it before. Others remarked that the event had celebrated its 50th anniversary the previous year without much excitement. They also spoke about declining participation numbers and recent rule revisions, believing that the convention itself was gradually losing popularity. Second found their conversation surprising. Despite aspiring to become sorcerers, none of them seemed to understand the true value of the chase ring. While its basic 10% activation chance could certainly appear unimpressive, anyone familiar with equipment ability upgrades should have recognized its hidden potential. The conversation soon shifted toward the attending spectators. Someone mentioned that Prince Klaus would be watching this year's convention. Others immediately connected his appearance to Class A and the presence of the second prince. Rumors about the poor relationship between the two brothers quickly surfaced, followed by stories claiming that the first prince frequently beat up the second prince under the pretense of training demonstrations. Some even praised the first prince while laughing about the rumors. Listening to everything, Second noticed that no matter where he went within the academy, the same narrative continued to spread. One that constantly contrasted the first prince with the second prince. The entire situation felt strangely artificial. Second found it difficult to believe that Main himself was responsible for such widespread opinions. Instead, he suspected that the first prince had deliberately manipulated public perception to damage Main's reputation. The level of hostility directed toward Main seemed excessive. Before long, Main arrived, causing the previously talkative students to immediately fall silent. Second greeted him and asked whether he had been designated as a seeded participant. Main confirmed that he would begin directly in the semifinals. Realizing the tournament bracket, Second noted that they would not face one another unless both reached the championship match. Main appeared confident that they would indeed meet in the finals. The sorcery convention followed a single elimination tournament format with 7 participants. Main occupied the left side of the bracket and needed only a single victory to reach the finals, while Second was positioned on the opposite side and would need to win 2 consecutive matches. However, there remained one important detail that Second still did not understand. He admitted that he had no idea how the sorcery convention actually worked. The surrounding students nearly fell from their seats upon hearing such an unbelievable confession. Main could hardly believe that someone had registered without understanding the event itself. Second simply apologized before casually assuming that the competition probably involved participants killing one another through sorcery. Main immediately rejected the idea. Second then wondered whether they simply fought normally instead. Main was left completely speechless before finally explaining the rules. The convention was conducted using a competition crown, an item primarily designed for player-versus-player competitions. Unlike ordinary duels, the competition crown allowed participants to compete without any actual danger. Every piece of equipment, skill, and limitation operated according to precisely established rules. Inside the competition, both HP and MP became virtual values, and all damage inflicted or received was likewise simulated. In contrast, ordinary PvP battles conducted with a dual crown took place in reality, meaning participants genuinely fought with their own bodies and could lose their lives once their HP reached zero. The competition crown eliminated that risk entirely. Even if a participant's HP reached zero during the match, the competition simply ended, and everything immediately returned to normal. Because of this, many players mocked it as a tool meant for cowards. Nevertheless, its flexible rule system fascinated numerous gamers, who experimented with its mechanics and eventually created entirely new forms of competition that differed greatly from traditional duels. Those creative formats gradually became popular. For this particular tournament, however, there was only one special restriction. Every attack had to be performed exclusively through sorcery. After listening to the explanation, Second finally understood everything. His confidence returned almost immediately as he silently concluded that the system resembled an absurd game mechanic. Not long afterward, it became his turn to compete. An official stepped into the center of the arena and announced the third match of the tournament. Second's opponent was Dean, a first-year student from Class F. As Second observed his opponent, Iko's enthusiastic cheering echoed throughout the venue. While waving excitedly, she accidentally struck Sylvia before innocently looking toward her without realizing what had happened. The referee then activated the competition crown. The competition arena consisted of a circular field with a radius of 50 meters. Leaving the designated area resulted in immediate defeat. With both competitors prepared inside the arena, the referee raised his hand and officially began the match. The referee declared the start of the battle. Dean, who was Second's opponent, immediately began casting a spell while Second remained standing calmly. From the color and formation of the sorcery, Second could tell that Dean was using the raptor form of wind. Second immediately concluded that Dean was an idiot. The Oppo form was an ordinary attack, the raptor form was a spread attack, the coral form was a powerful single-target attack, the fourth form was a powerful spread attack, and the fifth form was an extremely powerful spread attack. Their casting times increased in the following order: Oppo, Coral, Raptor, fourth and fifth. If a caster was struck by a specific attack while chanting, the spell would be interrupted. Because of that, using sorcery with a casting time as long as the raptor form or beyond was practically meaningless in a competition. It was common sense. Second wondered if Dean was simply making fun of him. Perhaps Dean had heard some rumor claiming that Second could not even use sorcery properly. The thought irritated him. Had this fool really looked down on the former world's #1? A faint smirk appeared on Second's face as he prepared to teach Dean a lesson. Stepping forward, he raised one hand and instantly cast the Oppo form of wind. Wind slowly gathered around his hand. At almost the same moment, Dean continued casting the raptor form of wind. Wind also gathered around Dean's hand. But before the spell could fully take shape, Second's attack struck it and caused the incomplete sorcery to disappear instantly. Second calmly reflected that when two sorceries collided, they possessed a unique interaction. By taking advantage of that property, it was possible to neutralize an opponent's attack. Although the caster would receive minor damage, the recovery time after using the Oppo form was at least twice as short as the recovery time after using the raptor form, creating an overwhelming advantage that more than compensated for the difference in attack power. Dean froze in shock. Without hesitation, Second activated the Coral form of fire. Flames immediately gathered around his hand. Thanks to his 5th class skill, the spell's casting time had been reduced by 2 stages while its attack power reached 300% of his converted INT value. A cold sweat covered Dean's body as he realized the danger. The instant the flames were released, the attack shot directly toward him. Upon impact, a massive explosion erupted, launching Dean high into the air. His scream echoed throughout the arena before he crashed heavily onto the ground. Second clicked his tongue inwardly. He had put too much power into the attack. His original intention had been to leave Dean with around 10% of his HP, so he could continue playing with him. Instead, the match had ended immediately. The referee stared blankly at the scene before finally recovering enough to announce Second as the winner. Once the competition crown deactivated, the battlefield returned to normal as though nothing had happened. Second glanced toward Dean, who stared back at him with pure terror, apparently having lost control of his bladder from fear. Turning toward his companions, Second casually remarked that he had won. Iko admired his overwhelming strength, while Sylvia worried that he had gone too far and wondered whether Dean would recover. Second dismissed the concern, believing it was insignificant since he would eventually become the world's #1 anyway. Besides, today would be their last day there, as they intended to escape immediately after obtaining the prize. Sylvia acknowledged that fact but still asked him not to overdo things. Second jokingly wondered whether she had become his mother. Sylvia remained stunned by the remark, while Iko simply encouraged him to keep doing his best. Shortly afterward, the next match was announced. The referee called the second semi-final, pairing Second, a first-year student from Class A, against Keith, a fourth-year student from Class A. The winner would advance to the championship match against Maine. At the signal to begin, Keith immediately rushed forward while Second remained perfectly calm. Second quickly recognized that Keith understood how the competition worked. In battles restricted entirely to sorcery between intermediate-level students, victory was usually decided by whoever made the first move. Naturally, relying primarily on the Oppo form, which possessed the fastest casting speed, was the smartest strategy. Without hesitation, Second cast the Oppo form of Wind. Keith instantly responded with the exact same spell. Wind gathered around both of their hands before the attacks collided in midair and canceled each other out. Second immediately realized that the battle had entered an endless stalemate. From that point onward, they would simply continue casting identical spells at nearly the same timing, causing every attack to collide and negate the other before resetting the situation back to the beginning. It was one of the flaws built into the Competition Crown's rules, and one of the main reasons why Second considered the entire system to resemble an absurd game. He let out a quiet sigh. Between ordinary competitors, reaching such a stalemate would have demonstrated impressive skill. Unfortunately for Keith, his opponent happened to be the former world's #1. During the deadlock, Keith attempted to persuade Second to surrender, even implying that an appropriate reward would be provided. Second found the proposal somewhat surprising and wondered about Keith's motive. Keith explained that he could not allow Second to face Maine. Pressed further, Keith admitted that his intention was for Maine to win the tournament so that he could later participate in a friendly exhibition against Prince Klaus. Second questioned why Keith would openly reveal something like that. Keith simply insisted that Second was unworthy of participating and should quietly lose. When Second asked whether Keith believed he would defeat both Maine and the first prince, Keith denied it. Instead, he claimed that only a match between Klaus and Maine possessed any real significance. Second immediately recognized the implication. Keith had brought politics directly onto the tournament grounds. Keith admitted that the current situation would never reach a conclusion otherwise. Narrowing his eyes, Second concluded that Keith had likely been ordered to ensure Maine reached the finals. He was almost certainly one of Klaus's subordinates. Under the pretense of a friendly exhibition, Klaus intended to publicly humiliate Maine before the spectators. The rumors circulating in the waiting area had not been entirely false after all. Second found himself genuinely irritated. It was not because of Klaus's political scheme. Rather, what truly annoyed him was Keith's confidence that he could negotiate during an endless stalemate and actually convince him to surrender. That assumption irritated him more than anything else. Second wondered whether Keith truly believed everything would proceed exactly as planned. Keith could only grit his teeth as another pair of wind attacks collided and disappeared. Without wasting a moment, both of them immediately switched to the Oppo form of fire, once again matching each other's timing perfectly. Second admitted that Keith possessed considerable skill if he could continue responding so precisely. Under normal circumstances, neither of them would ever break the deadlock. However, this situation was anything but normal. A confident smile spread across Second's face. Deciding that the opportunity had finally arrived, he prepared to show everyone what true skill looked like. Keith immediately sensed that something was wrong. Before anyone could react, Second summoned his longbow. Although the competition permitted only sorcery, he had already acted before anyone realized what he intended to do. Second briefly looked towards Sylvia, silently urging her to watch closely. As Sylvia stared in surprise, Second released an arrow engulfed in enormous flames. Magic archery was another excellent attack that utilized sorcery, and it was the second reason why Second considered the competition a shitty game. Unlike normal archery, magic archery did not actually use arrows. Instead, sorcery itself was placed onto the bow and released as the attack. Keith gritted his teeth, unable to find enough time to evade the incoming strike. In the next moment, flames completely engulfed him. As the fire gradually faded, Keith staggered from the damage before quickly retreating to regain his balance. Second then questioned whether this was the first prince's goal. Keith was visibly stunned. Seeing his reaction, Second realized that a competition where the only available method of attack was sorcery was clearly flawed. It was precisely because of this restriction that stalemates could occur. Prince Klaus must have possessed some kind of technique capable of breaking through such situations. Second recalled that Noir had once mentioned specializing in swordsmanship. If that was true, then there was a high possibility that Prince Klaus specialized in magic swordsmanship. As long as Klaus possessed that trump card within this competition, he would never lose against Maine. Second was certain that Klaus could strike Maine repeatedly without giving him any chance to retaliate, just like the situation Second was currently facing. Second decided that such cowardly tactics should be experienced firsthand so that people could understand how foolish they truly were. He once again drew the string of his longbow and prepared another spell in place of an arrow. While organizing the combination in his mind, he planned his attack carefully. First, he would secure his target with Knight Archery. Then, he would increase the power with Silver General Archery. Finally, he would enhance the impact using the Choral Form of Earth. It was a combination of 3 different skills. However, Keith immediately realized the danger and attempted to escape. Second calmly warned him that running away was pointless. He released the string, sending the attack directly toward Keith. Stones formed from earth magic struck Keith's body with tremendous force, knocking him down instantly. The referee remained frozen in shock for a moment before quickly recovering and announcing that the winner was Second. Meanwhile, the audience stared at the scene with wide eyes before suddenly rising from their seats and erupting into loud cheers. Second smiled as he watched the crowd celebrate his victory. Meanwhile, away from everyone's sight, Keith apologized to Klaus. Klaus replied that it was fine. He would just have to change his plans now. Still, it seemed he had found quite an interesting gem. He remarked that there was a high chance the so-called Second would win. If he could recruit Second, then his younger brother would remain in a difficult situation. Keith answered that the man would be a formidable opponent. Klaus responded by asking whether Keith really believed that man could refuse an invitation from the commander of the First Chivalric Order. Such a thing would never happen. Smirking, Klaus remarked that he never expected a magic academy to be hiding someone capable of combining different forms of sorcery. Attending the tournament had been the right decision. That man would make an excellent pawn. Keith remained silent. Meanwhile, at the arena, the referee announced that the finals were about to begin. Main stepped into the arena and commented on how incredibly powerful Second truly was. He admitted that he had a feeling it would turn out that way. Second apologized for hiding his true abilities and asked whether Main now looked down on him. Main smiled brightly and immediately denied it. Instead, he admitted that he liked Second even more now. Second replied that, in that case, Main should take him to the royal palace next time because he wanted to read the 4th form. Main happily agreed, though he hesitantly added a condition in return. Before he could continue, the referee interrupted, instructed both contestants to prepare themselves, and declared the start of the match. The cheerful expression vanished from Main's face as he instantly became serious. Both Second and Main cast the Oppo form of wind at the same time. Second thought that the choice was obvious. He would not use magic archery. It would be disrespectful to ignore the tournament's rules against an opponent who could only rely on sorcery. Besides, it would not be enjoyable. Main carefully watched for the perfect moment to launch his attack. Second expected Main to cancel the spell again and return the battle to a stalemate. However, his prediction was immediately proven wrong. His eyes widened slightly as he watched Main deliberately cancel his own spell. A powerful gust of wind wrapped around Main just as Second's attack reached him. Second immediately realized that Main had forcibly altered his own casting timing. At that moment, Main began casting another spell. Second reflected that being attacked while casting normally interrupted a spell. However, if someone started casting while already being attacked, the casting would not be interrupted. Main unleashed the choral form of wind. Second immediately responded with his own spell. A brilliant flash exploded between them. Second possessed a higher skill rank than Main, meaning his casting speed was also faster. Because of that advantage, despite casting later, both choral forms activated at exactly the same moment and completely canceled each other out. Once both attacks disappeared, Main stood frozen in disbelief. Looking at him, Second thought that such an expression should never appear during a player-versus-player battle. It practically announced that the attack had been his trump card. Second took a step backward. He realized he had underestimated Main. He had always lectured others never to underestimate their opponents, yet he had made that very mistake himself. Main had approached the battle with complete seriousness. If Main was fighting him with everything he had, then the proper response was to do the same. He decided to demonstrate the ultimate sorcery from Mobius Online, performing it with the pride of the man who had defended the title of Wise General 22 consecutive times. Second instructed Main to watch carefully. He then cast the choral form of fire. At the very same moment, Main cast the choral form of wind. Second launched the flames toward Main while calmly judging the distance. Years of experience had engraved the effective range into his instincts. There was no need to measure it. More importantly, he had never intended to use the choral form as a direct offensive attack. Main was shocked when the flames failed to strike him, and instead stopped directly in front of him. Only then did he notice that Second had already begun his next action. His eyes widened in disbelief. He realized he could not see any magic circle. Second demonstrated that sorcery could be used this way as well. Inwardly, he reflected that sorcery was not limited to attacking. It could also conceal one's next move. The technique he intended to use next was the raptor form, a wide-area attack with a lengthy casting time. However, once completed, its destructive power was extraordinary. The moment Main realized Second was casting again, he immediately became alarmed. Second completed the spell. Instantly, enormous stone pillars erupted from the ground in front of Main, completely cutting off his movement. Main's jaw dropped in astonishment. Second reflected that creating walls to restrict an opponent's freedom was another proper tactic in sorcery battles. It was one of the most fundamental techniques imaginable. There was absolutely no disadvantage in mastering it. Now all that remained was the finishing blow. Without hesitation, Second cast the coral form of water. Unable to evade it, Main could only watch as the attack struck him directly, sending him crashing to the ground. Main let out a disappointed sigh. When he sensed someone approaching, he raised his head and saw Second standing before him. After giving a brief laugh, he admitted defeat. The moment those words reached him, Second's expression darkened. Meanwhile, the audience erupted into loud cheers. Second fixed Main with a sharp glare and demanded to know why he was laughing. Main froze, stunned by the sudden hostility. Main was stunned and could only reply that Second was incredibly powerful. However, Second immediately denied it, explaining that if Main's coral form had reached at least the 5th class, he probably would have lost. He had been constantly standing at the edge of defeat, yet he had unknowingly underestimated Main. There was no trace of true strength in that. Main hesitantly questioned whether Second was saying that he was actually not strong. Second's expression darkened even further as he became frustrated. He asked whether Main was angry. Main had lost against someone who looked down on him, so shouldn't he be angry about it? Main lowered his gaze and quietly admitted that it was not really like that. Second told him not to lie to himself. If Main did not become angry at that moment, he would remain the same for the rest of his life. Main fell silent as he searched for an answer. Just then Prince Klaus arrived. He applauded Second and praised his magnificent perception, stating that Second's actions proved his point. As people said, his foolish younger brother lacked that kind of spirit, and Klaus had repeatedly told him the same thing countless times. Second glanced toward him. Klaus continued by saying that he had witnessed Second's abilities and found him truly impressive. Because of that, he granted Second special permission to join his ranks and personally study leadership under him. The audience was shocked by the unexpected offer. Meanwhile, Second considered the situation carefully. Becoming directly supervised by Klaus, the first prince, would guarantee him a position within the upper ranks of the first chivalric order. Furthermore, once Klaus became king, Second would likely receive an even greater promotion. It was an unbelievable opportunity, and everyone present understood that. However, refusing such an invitation would essentially mean publicly declaring himself an enemy of Klaus, the first prince. No ordinary person would ever reject such an offer. But Second was not ordinary. He gave Klaus a firm answer. He refused. The entire audience was shocked by Second's bold rejection. Klaus gritted his teeth in disbelief and asked him to repeat himself. Second calmly repeated that he refused. Klaus's expression twisted with anger. Meanwhile, Second had already predicted this outcome. Since Klaus could no longer directly humiliate Main because of his presence, Second expected that Klaus would eventually attempt to recruit him instead. After all, Klaus was the leader of that suspicious chivalric order. Klaus demanded to know whether Second truly did not want the offer. Second explained that before the match, he had already made a promise with Main to accompany him to the royal palace afterward. Main was surprised upon hearing this. In reality, the meaning behind Second's words was clear. He was declaring that he was already connected to the second prince. Although the agreement had only been made moments earlier, the referee nearby could serve as a witness. Klaus turned toward the referee with a threatening expression and asked whether that was true. The referee nervously nodded. Klaus gritted his teeth and accepted the answer. Since a contract had already been formed between Main and Second, interfering and attempting to recruit him would essentially be a public act of headhunting. Even as the first prince, Klaus could not ignore such etiquette. Filled with anger, Klaus stated that it was unfortunate but accepted the situation. From then on, Second would have to demonstrate his loyalty to Main. With that, Klaus immediately left. Main looked at Second with admiration shining in his eyes. Second thought that Main had completely forgotten the lesson he had been trying to teach him moments earlier. He then announced that it was time to continue the lesson. He asked Main to keep fighting against him until he finally became angry. Main was shocked by the request and begged him to show some mercy, insisting that there was no way he could defeat Second. Second immediately pointed out that this exact mindset was what Main needed to change. It was precisely because of this attitude that Prince Klaus called him his weak and foolish younger brother. Main complained that Klaus was too cruel toward him. He remarked that Second was extremely strict as well, almost like an older brother. Second immediately rejected the comparison and told him not to group them together. He lightly tapped Main's head with his fist and explained that the difference was because they were friends, calling him an idiot. Tears immediately formed in Main's eyes. Despite that, he smiled brightly and accepted. Meanwhile, on the way to the headmaster's office, Prince Klaus angrily cursed and slammed open the door. He demanded to know whether Paula Memento was present. The headmaster, Paula, stood up and politely asked him to calm down. Klaus angrily told her to be quiet and demanded all available information regarding the irritating person named Second. Paula immediately searched through her drawer and retrieved the documents. Klaus snatched them away and quickly scanned through the contents. His anger only increased as he realized the information was insufficient. He complained that the documents only described Second's activities at the academy. Paula explained that Second was a person surrounded by numerous mysteries. Even the island nation of Zipong, where he was supposedly born, remained completely unknown. Klaus's expression twisted in frustration. He cursed before throwing the documents aside and storming out of the office. Paula remained behind in silence. She eventually picked up the scattered documents from the floor and quietly remarked that she had heard Prince Klaus possessed a short temper. However, considering Second Cohen's mysterious nature, she believed she would need to investigate him more thoroughly.